The cold comes first. Before the music, before the mountains, before the slow creak of a cartwheel turning on a frost-bitten road, there's just the cold settling over everything like a quiet agreement between the land and the sky. Skyrim has always been that kind of place, a world where the unremarkable and the extraordinary share the same frozen air, often within arm's reach of one another. Before you drift any further, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We are going to spend time with all of it, the useless, the overlooked, the quietly extraordinary. Every detail has its own weight. Every strange corner of this world deserves at least a moment of unhurried attention. There is a small fish that lives in the rivers and streams of Skyrim called the silverside perch. It is not a useful fish. It cannot be cooked into a meal that restores health in any meaningful way. It cannot be used in alchemy. It weighs almost nothing and sells for almost nothing, and the vast majority of players have collected it, stared at it briefly, and dropped it somewhere they would never find it again. The silverside perch exists entirely on the periphery of everything Skyrim values as important, which is precisely what makes it interesting. Bethesda gave the fish a name. They gave it a model. They gave it a place in the world's ecosystem, swimming quietly in the cold shallows while dragonborn heroes strode past on their way to more significant destinations. The perch was not placed there to matter. It was placed there because someone, somewhere in the development process, believed that a river without fish would feel like an incomplete river. That belief, that the world should feel inhabited even in its most ignored corners, is responsible for more of Skyrim's atmosphere than any dragon or dungeon ever could be. The perch in the river is not there for the player. It is there for the river. And that distinction, small as it sounds, is what separates a world you visit from a world you believe in. When you hold one in your inventory and read the item description, there is no lore attached, no legend, just a fish, patient in silver, waiting for a purpose that was never planned for it. The Greybeards of High Hrothgar are perhaps the most deliberately unhurried characters in all of Skyrim. They have spent decades, in some cases centuries, practicing silence. Arngir, the one who speaks on their behalf, does so with the careful gravity of someone who has thought deeply about the cost of words. Every sentence he delivers feels considered. Every pause between those sentences feels earned. But there is something about the Greybeards that most players never stop to notice, because it requires waiting, and waiting is not something the game rewards. If you stand in the courtyard of High Hrothgar long enough without moving, the other Greybeards, those who have taken their vow of silence so seriously that they cannot even speak to the Dragonborn, will begin to meditate. They settle into a stillness that the mountain seems to approve of. The wind does not stop for them, but it does seem to soften. The stone beneath their feet holds them without protest. They are, by any measure, background characters. They have no quests attached to their names. They offer no rewards, no dialogue, no dramatic moments. They are simply present, practicing their discipline in an empty courtyard at the top of a mountain that most players visit twice and forget. Yet Bethesda gave each of them a daily routine. Each one moves, rests, and returns to stillness on a schedule that exists whether or not anyone ever watches. Master Bori, Master Wulfgar, Master Einarth. Their names are known only to those who looked closely enough to find them. The Dwemer left behind a great many things when they vanished. Animunculi still patrol their ruins. Tonal machinery still hums in chambers that have not felt living breath in thousands of years. Books about their philosophy and their ambition line the shelves of scholars across Tamriel, and none of those books agree entirely on what the Dwemer believed or why they pursued what they pursued. But among all the artifacts they left behind, one category is particularly strange in how ordinary it manages to seem. The Dwemer fork, the Dwemer bowl, the Dwemer pot. These items sit in the kitchens and dining areas of Dwemer ruins, as though the people who once used them simply stepped away from the table. They have the same angular, precise aesthetic as every other piece of Dwemer craftsmanship, geometric, functional, built to outlast everything around them. But they are utensils. They are the objects of daily domestic life, made by a civilization that was simultaneously attempting to transform the nature of existence itself. This says something about the Dwemer that their philosophy texts do not quite capture. They ate, they cooked, they sat down at tables and shared meals and used forks that were perhaps slightly more ornate than necessary. The ambition that drove them toward the heart of Lorcan and the project of becoming something other than mortal did not prevent them from building a world around themselves that was in its quieter moments just a world. The ruins are cold now. The forks remain. There is a book in Skyrim called The Lusty Argonian Maid. It is without question the most frequently discussed book in the entire game, and also one of the most deliberately ridiculous. It exists as a kind of winking acknowledgement from Bethesda's writers that the world of Tamriel contains not only epic poetry and serious historical accounts, but also pulp fiction of the most unambiguous variety. The book is found on shelves across Skyrim, read by nobles and merchants and innkeepers alike, and it tells the story of a lizard person and a fireplace with absolutely no ambiguity about where the story is heading. What is easy to miss, however, is that there is a sequel. The Lusty Argonian Maid, Volume 2, exists in the same world, on similar shelves, waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to check. Its author, attributed to one Crassius Curio, was a real figure in Morrowind lore, a Dunmer nobleman and playwright with a reputation for producing work that tested the limits of good taste. He appears in the previous Elder Scrolls game as an actual character you could meet and speak with. The fact that his most famous work survived the centuries and found its way onto the shelves of Skyrim is either a tribute to enduring literature or a commentary on exactly what kind of literature tends to endure. Either way, the book is there, both volumes. Patient and unapologetic, waiting on a shelf somewhere between a historical account of the Dragon War and a copy of something called Beggar Prince. The city of Markarth is built entirely inside a Dwemer ruin. The streets are stone. The architecture is old in a way that no amount of human habitation has managed to soften. Fires burn in forges that the Dwemer designed, and the Reachmen who first reclaimed this place from the Empire did so beneath ceilings that were old before their grandfathers were born. All of this is known to the player, stated plainly enough in the game's opening moments in the city. What is not stated plainly is that the water flowing through Markarth, the visible streams and channels that run beneath walkways and alongside market stalls, comes from the same Dwemer hydraulic system that the original builders installed thousands of years ago. The pumps still work. The channels still carry water. Somewhere deep beneath the floors of the city, Dwemer machinery is doing exactly what it was designed to do, faithfully, without maintenance, without understanding from the people it now serves. The citizens of Markarth draw water from a system they could not build and cannot fully explain. They cook with it, wash with it, live alongside it every day, and most of them have stopped noticing that it is remarkable at all. This is how long-standing miracles tend to go. They become background noise. They become expected. The wonder gets worn smooth by repetition until it is just another part of how things are. But the pumps keep running. They have always kept running. Sven and Fyendal are two of the earliest companions a player can recruit in the game, both living in the small town of Riverwood and both interested in the same woman, a young woman named Camilla Valerius, who runs the town's general goods store with her brother Lucan. Both men will offer to help the player as a means of undermining the other, each asking you to deliver a forged letter designed to make their rival look foolish. It is, by most standards, an extremely petty situation. What is quietly interesting about this arrangement is what happens long after the quest resolves. If the player takes no action and simply allows both men to continue living their lives in Riverwood, Sven and Fyendal go about their days with the forced politeness of two people who have decided not to discuss something that bothers both of them enormously. They pass each other near the mill. They sit near each other at the inn. They exist in the same small town with the same complicated feelings about the same woman, and neither of them ever fully resolves it. Camilla herself, meanwhile, can be married by the player, which presumably settles the matter in the most dramatic way possible, or she can simply continue working in her shop while Sven and Fyendal orbit her quietly for the rest of the game's runtime, their small drama entirely unresolved, their feelings entirely unchanged. Riverwood does not have the space or the bandwidth for resolution. It just keeps going, and so do they. There is a detail about the main menu of Skyrim that players have been seeing since 2011 without necessarily registering what it means. The silhouette on the menu screen, the Dragonborn, standing at the summit of the Throat of the World with Alduin circling above, changes depending on which version of the game you are playing. The original release had one configuration. Later anniversary and special editions adjusted it slightly. The posture, the lighting, the weight of the figure against the sky, these are not fixed. Most players have seen that menu hundreds of times. Many have not noticed that it shifted. The menu screen is, in one sense, the most viewed piece of art in the entire game. It is the thing you see before you begin, and the thing you return to every time you stop. It is the threshold between the ordinary world and the one you are about to walk into, and Bethesda treated it with a care that suggests they understood this. The figure on the mountain is not random. The choice to put a person at the summit, small against the sky, looking towards something the viewer cannot see, this was intentional. What the figure is looking at has never been explained. Sweet rolls appear in Skyrim more than almost any other consumable item that has no combat application. They are found in homes, on tables, in dungeons, in camps, in the inventories of NPCs who have no particular reason to be carrying pastries. They restore a modest amount of health, they weigh very little, they sell for almost nothing, and they are the subject of what has become one of the most recognized pieces of throwaway dialogue in the entire Elder Scrolls franchise. The line, delivered by a guard in the early moments of character creation, is about someone stealing your sweet roll. It is a nothing line, a placeholder piece of dialogue designed to illustrate the tone of the tutorial area, and yet it became something that players remembered, repeated, and turned into a kind of cultural shorthand for the whole game. Bethesda put sweet rolls on specific tables in specific homes for reasons that the game never explains. In some locations, the sweet roll appears to have been placed as though the NPC who lives there had just set it down before you arrived. In others, it sits on a shelf with the permanence of a decorative object, never touched, never disturbed. The sweet roll in those locations is not food in any meaningful sense. It is set dressing. It is atmosphere. It is Bethesda saying quietly that someone lives here and that someone has a small pleasure that they keep nearby. That is enough. That has always been enough. The Thieves Guild has a headquarters beneath the city of Riften, accessed through the city's elaborate sewer network, a place called the Ragged Flagon. It is a dark, damp, smoke-filled tavern that exists entirely underground and it caters to an extremely specific clientele. The fence who operates there, a woman named Tonelia, sells lockpicks and other tools of the trade to anyone with guild business. The barkeeper serves a drink called Hunting Brew Mead, which has its own extensive subplot about competition and sabotage and corporate espionage among breweries. What is easy to miss about the Ragged Flagon is that it has regulars, not guild members, just people. There are individuals in that underground tavern who appear to have nowhere else to go. They sit at their tables with the patience of people who have long since run out of better options, and they drink, and they do not bother anyone. The game does not explain why they are there or how they found the place. The Thieves Guild presumably tolerates their presence the way any establishment tolerates customers who keep paying and keep quiet. One of those regulars is a man named Bran Shea, who sits in the flagon under very specific circumstances that the player might have directly caused. If you frame him for theft in the early stages of the guild questline, he is arrested and imprisoned in Riften's jail. When his sentence ends, he returns to the flagon. He sits back down at his table. He does not appear to connect the experience with anything you did. His mead is waiting, as it always is. The skill book system in Skyrim is one of those features that operates almost entirely in the background of the player's awareness. Picking up a book and reading it can grant a skill point in a relevant area. A book about blade techniques improves one-handed skill. A book about destruction magic improves destruction, and so on. Most players know this in a general sense. Fewer players know the specific titles involved, and even fewer have ever sat down with all of them. There is a skill book for the Alteration School of Magic called the Lunar Lorcan. It is a cosmological text that attempts to explain the creation of Mundus, the mortal plane, through a particular theological lens. It is dense and strange and entirely optional reading, but it contains within it a version of the creation myth that differs from the versions told by other books, other cultures, and other corners of the Elder Scrolls universe. The disagreements between these accounts are not accidents. The lore of the Elder Scrolls was constructed with the specific intention that no single account would be definitive. This is called CHIM in the larger meta-lore of the franchise, the idea that reality is subjective and that different observers will perceive different truths with equal validity. This philosophy is baked into the game's books so thoroughly that reading broadly across Skyrim's library produces not a complete picture of the world's history, but a constellation of contradictory perspectives that the player is left to navigate alone. The Lunar Lorcan sits on a shelf somewhere, waiting to add one more voice to the argument. In the far northwest of Skyrim, past the college town of Winterhold, and along a stretch of coastline that most players never visit without a specific reason, there is a place called Septimus Signus's Outpost. It is reachable only by crossing a frozen sea, navigating ice flows that are beautiful in a desolate and inhospitable way, and finding the right crack in the right iceberg to slip through. Inside, an old man has been living alone for what appears to be a very long time. Septimus Signus was once a scholar of some renown. He worked on matters related to Dwemer research, and more specifically, to the Elder Scrolls themselves. But at some point, his studies led him somewhere that most minds do not return from intact. He has set up his outpost near an enormous Dwemer lockbox buried in the ice, a mechanism so large and so impossibly sealed that he cannot open it, and he has devoted the remainder of his life to finding a way. He speaks in a way that makes it clear that something has been altered in his thinking. His sentences arrive at unexpected angles. His references are to concepts and frameworks that require considerable lore knowledge to follow. And yet, underneath the strangeness, there is something recognizable, the posture of someone who has committed entirely to a single idea and simply never looked away. He is there alone. He has always been alone, and the box has still not opened. One of the quieter details embedded in Skyrim's economy is how differently the same item can be valued depending on who is selling it and where. A piece of iron ore pulled from a mine in the Reach will have a different effective value than the same ore sold in Whiterun, not because the game calculates regional pricing in any sophisticated way, but because the merchants in different holds have different amounts of gold on hand, different levels of the speech skill interacting with your own, and different baseline inventories that affect what they actually need. Iron ore is worth roughly 3 gold pieces. A plate of iron armor is worth somewhere between 60 and 100, depending on quality and enchantment. The labor implied by the difference between those two values is enormous, and the game acknowledges this gap by making smithing one of the most reliable ways to generate income outside of dungeon crawling. But there is a smaller thing inside this larger thing that deserves attention. Merchants in Skyrim restock their gold every 2 days of in-game time, which means that if you are patient, if you wait, come back, wait again, the same merchant can buy from you indefinitely. Some players have used this to build extraordinary wealth by selling cheese, by selling cabbages, by selling the ordinary produce of a world that was designed to feel like it feeds itself. Someone somewhere paid for Alduin's defeat in cheese wheels. They were not wrong to do it. The city of Solitude sits at the northwestern edge of Skyrim, perched on a great stone arch over a deep bay. It is the capital of the province and the seat of the High Queen, and it carries itself with the particular self-consciousness of a city that knows it is being watched. The buildings are tall and pale. The streets are wide enough for processions. The Blue Palace dominates the skyline with a confidence that seems to belong to a different, older era of Skyrim's political life. And at the very entrance to this capital city, the game begins with an execution. Rogvir is the man being executed as the player first arrives in Solitude, and his crime was opening the city gate for Ulfric Stormcloak after Ulfric killed High King Torrig. The crowd gathered to watch him die contains people who knew him. Advar, a fish merchant, is Rogvir's brother-in-law. He stands in the crowd with the particular misery of someone who has been given no good choices and is doing the only thing left available to him, which is watching. Rogvir, for his part, does not recant. He insists that what Ulfric did was lawful under Nord tradition, that the High King accepted the challenge, and that Ulfric won it fairly. The headsman does not engage with this argument. The crowd does not engage with it either. The execution proceeds, and Solitude carries on, and the player walks past all of it into a city that has already decided what it believes. Rogvir was telling the truth, by the way. Whether that matters depends on what you believe Skyrim's civil war is actually about. Hearthfire, the second major piece of downloadable content released for Skyrim, gave players the ability to purchase land and build their own homes from the ground up. This was a feature that many players had wanted for years. Not just the ability to buy a house, but to actually construct it, to make something that felt like a personal investment in the world. And Hearthfire delivered this in its careful, low-key way. But within that system, there were details that went almost entirely unnoticed. The children who could be adopted through Hearthfire, up to 2 per household, had their own preferences. They would comment on the furnishings of the rooms you built for them. They would bring home stray animals and ask to keep them. They would want to play games. They had names and small personalities, and those personalities were not interchangeable. One adopted child, a boy named Samuel who can be found at Honor Hall Orphanage in Riften, has a slightly different conversational texture than the others. He is more observant. His comments on the home you build tend toward the practical. He notices things like whether there is enough firewood, whether the room feels drafty, whether the door to his bedroom closes properly. The game does not make a production of this. It is simply part of who Samuel is, folded into his dialogue by someone who thought it mattered. It did matter. It does matter. The best details always matter most quietly. The College of Winterhold questline involves, among other things, a rogue student named Ancano who serves as an advisor to the Falmer, the elven supremacist organization that functions as one of Skyrim's most politically complex antagonists. Ancano is installed at the college against the wishes of its archmagister. He operates with a level of condescension that makes him memorable from the first conversation, and he eventually triggers the questline's central crisis by tampering with an artifact he does not understand. He is, in short, a villain, but he is a specifically bureaucratic villain, which is a rarer thing than the game's dungeons might suggest. Ancano does not want to conquer anything. He does not have a personal grudge or a wounded history. He is there because the Falmer sent him there, and he carries out the Falmer's interests with the efficiency of someone who believes entirely in the institution he represents. His menace comes not from cruelty, but from certainty. The college accepts him because it has to. The students resent him because they understand what he represents. And the game gives him just enough dialogue to make you feel by the end that you understand him, not sympathize with him, but understand him. He believed he was right. He believed the artifact's power was something the Falmer deserved to control. He may have even believed this was genuinely better for the world. Most dangerous ideas come with exactly that kind of sincerity. There are 46 different standing stones scattered across Skyrim, and 17 of them are the traditional guardian stones and skill stones that the game presents as major game mechanic features. The others, the smaller unmarked standing stones, are a quieter presence entirely. They dot the landscape without ceremony, arranged in patterns that have provoked considerable fan speculation about what they represent, or whether they represent anything at all. The traditional stones are ancient markers of blessing, each associated with a constellation in the Elder Scrolls cosmological framework: the thief, the warrior, the mage. These constellations govern broad categories of ability and were used in older Elder Scrolls games as character creation tools, with a player choosing a birth sign that influenced their starting attributes. Skyrim removed birth signs as a formal system and replaced them with the standing stones, preserving the mythology while changing the mechanical delivery. What this means, quietly, is that the night sky above Skyrim is not decorative. Those stars have names and histories that extend across the entire franchise, and the stones that reference them are physical anchors of that mythology embedded in the land. When a player touches a standing stone, they are interacting with a cosmological system thousands of years old within the fiction of the world, a system that predates Skyrim, predates the Nords, predates almost everything the player will encounter in their journey. The stars were there before the roads, that they will be there after. In the town of Dawnstar, on the cold northern coast of Skyrim, every resident is suffering from nightmares. This is the premise of a small questline that involves a priest of Mara named Erendur and an ancient Vermina artifact called the Skull of Corruption. The nightmares are real, invasive, persistent, and wearing the townspeople down in ways that have begun to affect their waking behavior. The innkeeper is exhausted. The miners are short-tempered. The Jarl's steward mentions the situation with the careful understatement of someone trying not to alarm anyone further. The questline that resolves this situation is one of the more tonally interesting Daedric quests in the game, largely because Erendur himself is compelling. He is a former servant of Vermina who converted to the worship of Mara and now actively opposes the Daedric influence he once served. His guilt is specific, and his commitment to undoing the harm his old faith caused is genuine. He is not performing redemption. He is attempting it, which is a different thing. There is a choice at the end of his quest line that the Daedric prince Mephala, speaking through the player's companion slot as Hermaeus Mora, or rather through a separate voice entirely, encourages you to make. The correct choice from a lore perspective is genuinely ambiguous. Erendur believes one thing. The logic of Daedric quests suggests another. Players who followed Erendur through his quiet history and chose the path his sincerity seemed to deserve have never entirely agreed on whether they were right. Dawnstar sleeps easier now. Whether that came at a cost is something only the player can know. Argonians are one of the 10 playable races in Skyrim and are among the most biologically unusual. They are reptilian humanoids native to a region called Black Marsh, a place so hostile to non-Argonian life that it has historically resisted every major conquest attempted against it. The Hist, enormous trees with psychoactive sap that form the spiritual foundation of Argonian culture, are, according to the lore, capable of something approaching sentience. Argonians bond with the Hist from birth. The relationship shapes everything about who they become. This matters in Skyrim in a way that the game doesn't draw attention to. Argonian player characters are far from home. They are far from the Hist. The bond that shapes Argonian identity is absent in Skyrim, present only in whatever memory the character carries of it, and the game makes no comment on what this absence might feel like. It is left entirely to the player's imagination, but the lore books fill in some of what the game leaves unsaid. Argonians in Skyrim often feel the cold more profoundly than their physiology should explain, and some scholars of Tamrielic culture have suggested that this may not be purely physical. The Hist connection provides a warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. Its absence leaves a quiet in the Argonian that no amount of mead by any fire ever entirely fills. There is an Argonian dock worker in Windhelm named Shavi. She is one of the warmest-natured characters in the city. She lives in conditions that would justify bitterness, and she has chosen otherwise. The game does not explain this. It just shows you. The word walls scattered across Skyrim are one of the game's most recognizable features, towering stone inscriptions that glow faintly blue and wait for the Dragonborn to approach and absorb a word of power. Each wall teaches a segment of a shout, and shouts are built from the language of the dragons, a tongue called Dovazul that was constructed for the game by linguist and language designer at David J. Peterson's team, though its roots were established earlier in Bethesda's development process. What most players do not linger on is that each word wall is also a piece of writing. They are not simply phonetic transcriptions of power words. They are poems. They are narratives. They tell stories about the dragons who carved them, about the events that inspired the shout being taught, about the history of the place where the wall stands. The text wraps around the stone in flowing dragon script, and the full translations, available through dedicated fan scholarship, reveal histories that the game never directly shares with you. A word wall at a place called Autumn Watch Tower speaks of a dragon named Krajotan. It describes his hunting grounds and the prey that flew in the thermals over the mountain range he claimed. The wall was not placed there randomly. It was placed there because Krajotan, or something that once bore that name, had a relationship with that specific ridge of stone. The dragons did not just carve words. They wrote histories of themselves into the mountains because they understood that the mountains would outlast almost everything else. The orphanage in Riften, Honor Hall, is run by a woman named Grelid the Kind, which is a joke the game delivers entirely with a straight face. She is not kind. She is strict to the point of cruelty, disapproving of laughter and running and the particular hope that children tend to carry despite their circumstances. The children in her care know this. They speak about her with the careful language of people who have learned to be measured. One of them, A child named Aventus Aretino has run away from the orphanage. He has returned to his childhood home in Windhelm, which is empty now that his mother is gone, and he has been performing the Black Sacrament. He has been asking the Dark Brotherhood to kill Grelid the Kind. He is a child. He is doing this alone in an empty house with the total conviction of someone who has determined that this is the only option remaining. The game allows you to fulfill his request. It is one of the earliest points at which the player can access the Dark Brotherhood questline, and the mission is, technically, the murder of an elderly woman who runs an orphanage. The game frames it with gentle absurdity. The reward is small, Aventus is grateful, and the children react to the news with visible relief. The tone does not ask you to feel guilty, but the detail is there if you look for it. Aventus spent weeks in that house, alone, performing a ritual he had probably only ever read about, in the hope that something in the world would hear him and respond. Something did. The Bard's College in Solitude is one of those institutions in Skyrim that has a questline attached to it, without being particularly central to anything else the game is doing. You join, you retrieve something, you perform at a festival. The festival, the burning of King Olaf, is, as festivals go, more historically interesting than the questline that precedes it. King Olaf One-Eye is a figure from Skyrim's history who captured a dragon named Numenex and imprisoned it in Dragon's Reach, the Great Hall of Whiterun. He is celebrated as a hero and commemorated in song, but the bard Svaknir wrote a poem about him that took a different view, that Olaf was not a hero but a tyrant, and that the capture of Numenex was accomplished through deception rather than valor. King Olaf had Svaknir killed and his poem destroyed. The poem survives, of course. The player finds it. And the act of burning King Olaf in effigy at the festival takes on a slightly different weight once you know what Olaf did to protect his reputation. He destroyed a man's life's work to preserve a story that was not entirely true. The festival that Solitude celebrates every year is, in one reading, not a commemoration of a hero, but a ritual burning of a revisionist history that never quite managed to erase the thing it was trying to erase. Svaknir still got his poem read in the end. It just took a few centuries. The waterfalls of Skyrim are, from a purely acoustic standpoint, one of the most quietly impressive achievements in the game's sound design. Each one sounds different. The waterfall near Iverstead sounds different from the falls near Markarth, which sounds different from the cascades in the Rift, which sounds different again from the thin streams that come off glaciers in Eastmarch and make a sound more like sustained breath than rushing water. These are not the same sound file looped. They are distinct compositions for distinct environments. The Reach's waterfalls tend toward a lower register, heavier, more geological, as though the stone itself is producing the sound. The Rift's falls have a warmth in them, a golden season quality that matches the amber leaves and soft light of that hold's particular aesthetic. Falkreath's water sounds melancholy in a way that is difficult to attribute to any single quality. It simply does. Jeremy Soule, who composed the game's music, has spoken about his intention to make Skyrim's score feel like it was emerging from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. The sound designers seem to have worked from a similar philosophy. The world does not have music, and then separately have ambient noise. The ambient noise is part of the music. The waterfalls contribute. The wind through mountain passes contributes. The distant sounds of wolves calling to each other across the dark contribute. All of it is the score. You just have to be still long enough to hear the parts that aren't written down. There is a ship docked in Windhelm called the Katariah, and it appears during a specific quest late in the game's main political storyline. The Katariah is the Imperial Legion's flagship, an enormous vessel that represents the military reach of the Empire in Skyrim. It sits at anchor in the Windhelm Harbor under specific narrative circumstances, and the quest that takes the player aboard it is typically resolved within a single evening of play. What is worth noting about the Katariah is how fully realized it is as a space. Ships in Skyrim are, as a rule, fairly modest in their interior dimensions. They serve as locations, as flavor, as suggestions of the province's maritime connections. The Katariah is different. It has officers' quarters, it has a brig, it has a navigation room with charts on the table and instruments mounted to the walls. Someone built a ship that functions like a ship, with the spaces that a ship of that type would actually need. The crew responds to intrusion with the urgency appropriate to soldiers aboard a military vessel. The captain behaves like a captain. The layout makes sense for a seagoing command ship, with considerations for hierarchy and function built into where the rooms are placed relative to each other. All of this for a location that most players pass through in under 20 minutes. All of this for a space that most players never go back to. Jarl Igmund of Markarth has a steward named Rarice. Rarice is a careful man. He gives very little away in casual conversation, maintaining the professional reserve that a steward needs in order to function effectively at the intersection of politics and household management. He is competent. He is not memorable in the way that more flamboyant characters are memorable, but there is something tucked into Rarice's personal quarters that the game placed there without comment. He is secretly a worshipper of Talos. In a political climate defined by the White Gold Concordat, the treaty that banned Talos worship throughout the Empire and its territories, enforced in Skyrim by the Falmer, Rarice is a man in an extremely exposed position, practicing a banned faith quietly and with considerable risk. He keeps a Talos amulet. He keeps related reading material, and he keeps these things where the wrong person could easily find them, because a man who has spent his life being careful about everything else has perhaps decided that this one thing will not be hidden too deeply. The player can discover this. The player can use it. The game offers you the option of blackmailing him. Many players have. Whether they thought about who they were blackmailing, a middle-aged bureaucrat who prays quietly in a hold where Thalmor agents operate, probably depended on how much attention they were paying that day. Rarice's secret is entirely his own. He asks no one to find it. The roads of Skyrim connect everything that matters, and most of what doesn't, and they carry with them a constant traffic of travelers, merchants, soldiers, and the occasional philosopher. Most of this traffic is background, characters moving between locations on schedules that the game simulates without requiring the player to notice. But occasionally, the roads offer something worth stopping for. A traveler named Klepper can sometimes be encountered outside Markarth, walking the road with the purposeful unhappiness of someone who is doing something they would rather not be doing. Klepper runs the Silverblood Inn in Markarth, and his marriage is not a particularly warm one. His wife, Frabby, has opinions about the inn's management, and is not shy about sharing them loudly in the dining area in front of guests. Klepper absorbs this without visible enthusiasm for confrontation. Finding him on the road outside the city, walking with no stated destination, gives the impression of a man who has found a reason to be somewhere that is not the Silverblood Inn, at least for a little while. The game does not explain his errand. He may not have one. He may simply be walking. There is something in that small, unscripted sadness that Skyrim captures better than most things it tries to capture. Not the epic grief, not the loss of great things and great people, just the ordinary unhappiness of someone who has chosen a life and found it slightly smaller than expected, walking a road that goes somewhere and also, eventually, back. The Falmer are one of Skyrim's most enduring sources of dungeon horror. pale, hunched, sightless creatures that attack with a viciousness disproportionate to their broken-looking frames. They are found primarily in Dwemer ruins, sharing the depths with the animunculi that still patrol those spaces, and they carry a wrongness that is difficult to place precisely. They feel like something that should not have happened. This is because, within the lore of the game, the Falmer are not a natural species. They are the Snow Elves, the Falmer of ancient Skyrim, an elven civilization that once rivaled the early Nords. When the Nords drove them out, the Snow Elves sought refuge with the Dwemer. The Dwemer agreed to shelter them on one condition, that they eat the Dwemer's subterranean fungal crops. Those crops took their sight, and then, over generations, they took everything else. Knight Paladin Gelibor is a Snow Elf who refused. He is found in a sanctuary dedicated to Ariel, preserved in a kind of extended devotional isolation, and he is the last Snow Elf who retains his original form and mind. He speaks about his people with the quiet grief of someone who has had thousands of years to sit with what happened to them. He does not use the word Falmer. They are still, to him, the Snow Elves. They were. They are not any longer. The distinction matters to him in a way that the game allows to be sufficient. There is a location in Skyrim called Pine Watch. It is from the outside, an ordinary farmhouse, the kind that populates the countryside with no particular invitation for attention. A single occupant. A modest layout. Nothing to suggest that what lies beneath it is a bandit hideout of considerable size, accessed through a concealed mechanism in the basement and descending into a tunnel network that feels out of all proportion to the unassuming exterior. Pine Watch is one of Skyrim's small pleasures for players who like the game's tendency to hide large things inside small exteriors. The transition from the cozy domestic space of the farmhouse into the stone passages below is an architectural joke that the game delivers with complete sincerity. The man who lives upstairs knows what is underneath him. He is counting on you not knowing. The modest exterior is the trick, and the trick works precisely because the game has trained you to pass by modest exteriors without stopping. The bandits below have, in their possession, a variety of small personal effects that speak to lives being lived in the gaps between their more professionally dishonest activities, books, letters, food that someone cooked, the kind of evidence that the game uses to remind you that even the enemies you clear from dungeons were before you arrived just people sitting somewhere in the dark, eating dinner and reading. The darkness below Pine Watch smells like any other occupied space. It smells like people. One of the quieter mechanical realities of Skyrim's world is that horses do not like to be stolen. This is perhaps obvious, but the way the game registers a horse's legitimate ownership is interesting in practice. A horse purchased from a stable is flagged as yours. A horse that belongs to a stable and has not been purchased is available to ride, but is technically being borrowed without permission, which generates a small crime value and may result in a guard commenting on your lack of a horse of your own. This creates a subtle social system around horse ownership that the game never explains formally. You could ride someone else's horse for long stretches of the game's runtime and simply pay the occasional small fine, or you could invest in a horse of your own and have something that the law recognizes as a genuine possession. Arvak, obtained through the Dawnguard questline in the Soul Cairn, is a horse that cannot be stolen because it belongs to no one but you. It is summoned rather than ridden to the stable, appearing from a conjuration flame in the player's hand, and it dissolves back into that same flame when dismounted. It cannot be killed permanently. It costs you nothing to feed. It is the most practical horse in the game, and also, visually, the most striking. A skeletal mount, with flames flickering in its eye sockets, cantering across the tundra without apology. The inn at Rorikstead has a stable. Arvok has never needed it. Blackreach is the name of a vast underground city that the player discovers during the main quest line, specifically while following the trail of an Elder Scroll. It is enormous. It is lit by bioluminescent fungi that cast everything in a blue and amber glow, and it occupies a space beneath the surface of Skyrim that feels impossibly large for something the player wasn't looking for. Dwemer architecture extends in every direction. Animunculi patrol. And somewhere in the heights of that cavernous space, a dragon named Vulthuryol sleeps. You can wake him by finding a great aura stone in the center of Blackreach and using the unrelenting force shout on it. The stone rings, the Vulthuryol descends. He has presumably been up there for a very long time, sleeping in the vault ceiling of an underground space, and the game offers no explanation for how he got there or why a dragon would choose to sleep underground rather than on a mountain or a word wall like his counterparts on the surface. Vulthuryol's name translates in Dovazul to something approximating Dark Overlord Mortal. It is a name with weight. It is the name of a creature with ambitions, or at least pretensions toward grandeur. And he has been sleeping in a cave, in the dark, above a dead Dwemer city, for what the timeline of the game suggests could be well over 4,000 years. He does not complain about this when he wakes. He simply attacks, which is perhaps the most dignified response available to him. The enchanting system in Skyrim allows players to add magical properties to weapons and armor, and it is one of the deeper mechanical systems in the game when pursued to its fullest extent. Most players use it functionally, adding fire damage to a sword, adding magicka regeneration to a hood, combining effects for a particular playstyle. But there is a subset of players for whom the enchanting system becomes an end in itself. The most powerful enchanting builds require layered perks, enchanter perks to strengthen enchantments, alchemy perks to create potions that further boost enchanting, and smithing perks to increase the base quality of the items being enchanted. The loop between these three systems creates a feedback cycle that at its extreme end produces items of genuinely absurd power. A sword that deals enough fire damage to kill most enemies in one hit. Armor that reduces spell costs to nothing. Potions whose effects are strong enough to count as exploits. But there is a smith in Solitude named Byrond who will comment on your crafted equipment if you show it to him. He will notice if it's particularly fine work. The game built in a reaction to player craftsmanship, a nod of professional recognition from an NPC who presumably knows good armor when he sees it. Most players never hear him say this because they never thought to stop at his forge just to show him what they made. He would have been impressed. He was designed to be. In the swamp village of Morthal, there is a woman named Alva who presents as an ordinary citizen during the initial conversations the player might have with the town's residents. She has a house, she has a schedule, she gives no particular reason to look twice. But Morthal is a small enough place that almost everyone in it is connected to the mystery that defines the town. A fire, a dead woman, a surviving husband who cannot account for what happened. Alva is a vampire. The game reveals this over the course of the relevant quest line, and her house contains a coffin and a journal that explains considerably more than she has been letting on. But what is interesting about Alva is not the revelation itself. Vampire in disguise is not an unusual narrative beat, but the way her daily routine prior to the revelation makes sense in retrospect. She sleeps during the day. She becomes active at night. She avoids prolonged direct conversation with the more observant residents. The behaviors that the game generates for her as part of her daily schedule are entirely consistent with what she is, even before the player knows what she is. Bethesda wrote a vampire character and then gave her a vampire schedule and trusted that players who paid attention might notice before the questline told them what to notice. Most players didn't notice. The schedule was there regardless. The Temple of Dibella in Markarth is dedicated to the Daedric Prince of beauty, love, and artistry, and it is tended by a sisterhood of priestesses who maintain their rituals with an exclusivity that makes the player work slightly harder than usual to access the inner sanctum. Getting inside requires either sneaking in or obtaining specific permission, and the game treats the interior of that sanctum as genuinely sacred space, a place where something is actually happening, not just window dressing for a dungeon. Inside the sanctum, the priestesses are attempting to commune with Dibella through a young girl named Fiotra, who they believe is the Sibyl, Dibella's chosen vessel among mortals. Fiotra is not there. She has been taken by Forsworn. The questline that follows involves finding her and returning her to the temple, and it concludes with a ceremony that the game renders with quiet dignity. What the questline does, in its unhurried way, is treat the religious practice of this fictional institution as real. The priestess's grief over Fiotra's absence is genuine. Their relief at her return is genuine. The ritual they perform at the conclusion is not played for irony or spectacle. It is simply a ceremony in a temple, attended by people who believe in what they are doing. Skyrim does this better than most games do. It builds faiths that its believers believe in, and it lets you watch them believe without requiring you to share the faith or mock it. There are 29 Daedric artifacts obtainable in Skyrim, each associated with one of the Daedric princes who take an interest in the mortal world. The collection of all of them, the Oblivion Walker achievement, requires the player to navigate quest lines that range from tragic to comedic to genuinely disturbing. The reward for collecting them all is an achievement notification and the quiet satisfaction of a completed thing. But the artifacts themselves, considered individually, are strange objects. They are not merely powerful, they are personalities. Each one carries the mark of the prince who created it, not just in its enchantment, but in its history, in what it was used for, in the legends that have grown around it across Tamriel's long record. Wabajak, given by Sheogorath after a quest line in Solitude that involves tea, paintings, and cheese, transforms enemies into random creatures or objects. Its effects are unpredictable by design. Sheogorath, the Prince of Madness, made a weapon that cannot be used strategically, only enthusiastically. The artifact reflects the mind that made it. The Ebony Mail, given by Boethia after a quest line that requires you to betray a follower at a sacrificial altar, deals poisonous damage to nearby enemies and muffles the wearer's movements. It is an assassin's artifact made by a prince of murder and intrigue, and it asks a serious moral cost of the player before it can be obtained. Boethia is not subtle about what she values. Every artifact is, in some sense, a self-portrait. The princes have given you themselves in the form of objects, and you carry them through the world on your back, wondering where to store them all. The ruins of Helgen sit in the southern part of Skyrim, and most players have passed through them twice, once at the start of the game when Alduin's arrival interrupts an execution and allows the player to escape into the burning town, and once, if they return later, to find the ruins picked over by bandits. The second visit is, for many players, a strange experience. The tutorial space has become a dungeon. The path that walked you through character creation is now a stretch of scorched buildings with loot containers and hostile occupants. Helgen had a population. There were soldiers present for the execution. There were townspeople visible in the opening cinematic, watching the Imperial caravan arrive. There was a Helgen that existed before the game began, a small imperial town at the southern border of the province that had presumably lived its ordinary life for years before Alduin arrived and ended it. None of those people are acknowledged after the opening sequence. The survivors, if there were any, scatter into the narrative without follow-up. The town's history before that one day is entirely implied rather than stated. Skyrim began for the player in the middle of something that was already happening, and what was happening involved a place full of people who had nothing to do with any of it. Helgen was not in any of the prophecies. It just had the misfortune of being where Alduin happened to land. Cicero is, objectively, one of the more demanding characters the game asks you to spend time with. He is the keeper of the Night Mother, a mummified figure central to the Dark Brotherhood's mythology and practice, and he pushes the particular variety of theatrical eccentricity that Bethesda's writers gave him with an enthusiasm that can feel like it occupies all available space. He laughs at his own jokes. He dances. He refers to himself in the third person and to the Night Mother in terms that suggest a reverence that has been under pressure for a very long time. What the game does not draw attention to is Cicero's journals. They are findable, and they tell a different story from the one his current behavior suggests. Cicero was, before the deterioration of the Brotherhood, a more composed figure. He was not a normal person by any standard, but the journals show someone whose care for the Night Mother's preservation and the Brotherhood's traditions was not merely eccentric expression, but genuine, principled devotion. The institution he served collapsed around him. He buried the Night Mother's coffin in different cities across Tamriel, moved her, reburied her, kept her safe while everything else fell apart. He did this alone. The journals track the toll of that isolation, the creeping strangeness, the darkening humor, the conversations held with a body that did not respond. By the time the player meets Cicero, what is left is a person who went through something very long and very difficult and came out the other side as Cicero. The dancing is not unconnected from the journals. The mountain called the Throat of the World is the highest point in all of Tamriel, and at its summit sits a courtyard of ancient stone where the Greybeards brought the player to teach them the way of the voice. The courtyard looks out over the whole of Skyrim on clear days, the holds below rendered small and manageable from that height. The distances between places that feel enormous at ground level collapsed into something almost comprehensible from above. But the summit of the Throat of the World is not the courtyard. The summit is higher still, and it requires a specific quest to reach. The very top is called Paarthurnax's Roost, and Paarthurnax, the master of the Greybeards, a dragon who chose to serve the mortals he once preyed upon, who has spent thousands of years sitting at the highest point in the world, meditating on self-mastery, waits there. He is old in a way that even the other dragons are not. He was present at the beginning of the Dragon War. He was Alduin's lieutenant. He knows what he is capable of and has been choosing every day for millennia not to be that thing. He describes this as the hardest fight he has ever engaged in, and the game has the wisdom to take him at his word. The wind at the top of the Throat of the World does not stop. Paarthurnax sits in it regardless. He has been sitting in it for a very long time, and he will continue, and the mountain does not ask him why. The companions are the warrior guild based in Whiterun, operating out of a place called Jorvaskr, a great mead hall that is, according to its own legends, an overturned longboat that sailed through the sky and came to rest on the hill where it now sits. The legend is treated as entirely sincere by the people who live within it. No one in Jorvaskr has looked at their home and said, well, this is probably not literally what happened. It is simply the story of how they came to live here, and it is told that way and believed that way, and that is enough. The companion's questline involves a secret that the Circle, the inner leadership of the guild, has been keeping. They are werewolves. This is presented as a revelation meant to carry weight, and it does carry weight within the questline's drama. But the more interesting detail lives slightly to the side of that revelation. The companions, as a fighting tradition, predate the werewolf business by a significant margin. They were founded by a warrior named Ysgramor, who led the first human settlers into Skyrim from the continent of Itmora. Ysgramor's axe, Vulthuryol, a weapon of almost mythological status in Nord culture, was shattered and scattered after his death, and the questline involves reassembling it. The reassembled Vulthuryol is a real weapon you can carry. Ysgramor has been dead for thousands of years. His axe was buried with him. The companions reassembled it. You are carrying a legend. Try not to drop it. The Falkreath hold occupies the southwest of Skyrim, bordering Cyrodiil, and it has a quality that the other holds do not quite share. The forests there are darker than forests in the Rift, despite similar tree density. The light comes through differently. The hold's most prominent feature, its large cemetery, has given Falkreath a reputation for being the province's most melancholy corner, though the people who live there seem to have made a kind of peace with their surroundings. The cemetery is tended by a gravedigger named Runil, who is an Altmer, a high elf, living out his days in a very human town doing a very humble occupation. His backstory, revealed through conversation, is one of the more quietly devastating ones in the game. He served as a battle mage in a war before the game takes place, and the things he saw and did in that service led him here, to this hold, to this work. He buries people. He tends to the graves of people he never knew in life, maintaining them with a care that goes beyond professional obligation. He has found, in the repetitive work of a graveyard, something that the work of a battle mage could not offer. He is not at peace. The conversations make clear that peace is not the right word, but he is present, and he is useful, and he has chosen to spend whatever time he has left making sure that the people of Falkreath are put properly to rest. The gravedigger of Falkreath is an ancient war mage who needed somewhere to put his hands that would do less harm. Falkreath seems to have accepted him. Thieves in Skyrim, when caught in the act by a guard, are given options that reflect a slightly more nuanced justice system than the standard combat resolution. You can pay a fine, you can be sent to prison, you can resist arrest and fight the guards. Or in holds where you have enough influence, with the Thieves Guild, you can bribe the guard to look the other way. This last option scales. The more influence the guild has in a particular hold, the easier and cheaper the bribe. And building guild influence in a hold requires completing what the game calls reputation quests, small jobs that establish the guild as a presence in the local underworld and cultivate the kinds of relationships that make corrupt guards possible. What this means, in practice, is that the Thieves Guild questline builds a shadow economy alongside the main story. Every fence established, every landmark marked as a guild safe house, every guard brought into the arrangement, all of it creates a texture of organized corruption that the game renders in small, daily ways. A guard who nods and looks away. A merchant who charges less for stolen goods. A city that has quietly been partially purchased. By the end of the guild quest line, if the player has done the reputation work, the major holds of Skyrim have each been touched, not conquered, not dramatically altered, just adjusted slightly in the guild's favor. Enough to matter, not enough for most people to notice, which is, of course, exactly how the guild prefers it. Sovngarde is the Nord afterlife, the hall of valor in the heavens, where the honored dead gather to feast and fight and wait for the great final battle. The player visits it during the main quest line, and the visit is one of the game's most visually striking moments. The sky above Sovngarde is enormous. The mists that fill it are thick and difficult to navigate, and in those mists, Alduin has been feeding on the souls of the dead, those who cannot find the hall and are left wandering. The heroes who stand inside the hall and await the player's arrival are specific. They are named. They are figures from Nord legend and history who have been waiting in Sovngarde for a long time, and they speak about their long residence there with a contentment that the mists and Alduin's predation has not managed to fully erode. They are, by any measure, the Nords that Nord culture most aspired to produce. Warriors who fought well and died honorably and found the hall prepared for them. 3 of them help the player fight Alduin at the climax of the main quest. Their combined shout with the Dragonborn is what weakens the World Eater enough to make him vulnerable. The heroes of Sovngarde are not there purely for atmosphere. They are participants. After Alduin falls, they return to the hall. The player is told, gently, that it is not yet time for them to stay. The Dragonborn is sent back to the living world, which is a kind of gift dressed as a dismissal. It was not yet time. That is how they put it. And it wasn't. Lydia is the first housecarl that most players acquire, assigned to the Dragonborn after the defeat of the dragon at the Western Watchtower outside Whiterun. She is Whiterun's first housecarl, and she is sworn to the Dragonborn's service without being consulted about this arrangement, which she handles with the combination of professionalism and barely concealed resignation that has made her one of the most beloved NPCs in the game. Her line, delivered in a tone that suggests the speaker has given the concept of enthusiasm considerable thought and found it unnecessary, is one of those accidental character studies that Skyrim periodically produces. The words themselves are neutral. The delivery makes them a complete emotional portrait. She is carrying your burdens. She is doing so. She will continue to do so. There was never any question about whether she would continue to do so. Lydia can be killed. She has no essential tag, which means the game does not protect her from death in combat. Players who have lost her have, across 13 years of the game's existence, expressed grief about this in ways that are disproportionate to the amount of personal information Lydia ever shared. She had a name. She carried things. She followed you without complaint to places that were almost certainly going to be dangerous. That was apparently enough. She is missed. The Dwemer ruins contain, among their animunculi and their ancient machinery, a variety of containers that still hold Dwemer artifacts. Bent metal pieces, so gyros, small lever mechanisms, tonal resonators. These pieces serve primarily as smithing materials, melted down at a forge to produce Dwemer ingots for crafting equipment. Most players collect them industrially, moving through Dwemer ruins with their eyes on the containers, rather than on the engineering achievements those containers are sitting inside. But the artifacts themselves, considered as objects rather than materials, are curious. The Dwemer built everything with a precision that suggests obsessive attention to tolerances and function. Their everyday items are constructed as though the people making them believed very strongly that the everyday deserved the same care as the extraordinary. A cooking pot made by the Dwemer is more precisely made than most civilizations' finest artifacts. This attitude appears to have extended to their failures as well. There are machines in Dwemer ruins that have broken down in very specific ways that suggest the machine was designed with its own eventual failure in mind, built with components that could be isolated and replaced. The Dwemer maintained their machines the way they maintained their philosophy, comprehensively, with contingencies built in. They vanished anyway. The contingencies did not account for that. In the Rift, in a small clearing that can be found by wandering off the main road between Riften and Iverstead, there is a pond with a skeleton at the bottom. The skeleton is in a chair. The chair is at a desk. On the desk is a bottle of wine and 2 cups. There is no note. There is no quest marker. There is no explanation. Players who find this location spend considerable time with it. The theories accumulate. A romantic rendezvous that became a tragedy, a philosopher who chose to end their meditations at the bottom of a pond, two people who decided to face something difficult together and chose water as their witness. None of these theories is confirmed by the game, because the game never intended to confirm anything. It placed a skeleton in a chair at a desk at the bottom of the pond with a bottle of wine and 2 cups, and left the rest for whoever happened to look down. This is one of the things Skyrim does that no formal documentation fully captures. It creates spaces that invite meaning without requiring it. The skeleton at the desk is not a puzzle. It is a picture with a missing caption, and every player who finds it supplies their own. The game trusted that finding the location would be enough, that the specific combination of elements would do enough work that no explanation was needed. The wine at the bottom of the pond has been there for as long as the game has existed. The glass is still full. Markarth's Silver Blood family is one of the most quietly powerful forces in Skyrim's political landscape, though their reach is largely contained within the Reach itself. The Silverbloods own the Sidna Mine, a prison built into a working silver mine where the criminals of Markarth are put to work, extracting ore that funds the family's operations. This arrangement is presented to the player with minimal fanfare. The mine is mentioned. The family's ownership is mentioned. The implication is left to sit. The implication is that the Markarth prison system is a for-profit enterprise operated by a private family. The criminals of Markarth are not incarcerated for the purpose of rehabilitation or even simple punishment. They are incarcerated for the purpose of extracting silver for the Silver Blood family's benefit. The guards of Markarth enforce laws that the Silver Bloods benefit from, and in many cases can be argued to have influenced. This is all stated quietly in the background of a quest line that has other concerns at its center. Skyrim does not ask you to have opinions about the economics of incarceration. It simply builds a city on top of an arrangement that raises considerable moral questions, and then populates that city with people who live inside the arrangement without necessarily examining it. The city operates, the mine produces, the Silver Bloods prosper. The guards nod. This is presented as simply the way things are in Markarth. The way things are in Markarth is considerably darker than the architecture suggests. There is a Khajiit caravan that camps outside Whiterun, led by a merchant named Risad. The Khajiit are cat people from the province of Elsewhere, and their caravans are a consistent presence across Skyrim's roads, traveling merchants who set up camp outside cities because the cities themselves will not allow them entry. The guards cite various reasons, all of them gesturing toward a general suspicion of outsiders that Skyrim's culture carries in its bones. Risad has opinions about this. He will share them if you ask, and what he shares is a portrait of a people who have made peace with being viewed as perpetual outsiders by finding their belonging in each other and in the road. The caravan is the home. The merchants who travel it are the community. The cities that refuse them entry are simply obstacles, managed and navigated rather than confronted or resented. He sells goods that the Khajiit caravans specialize in: alchemy ingredients, unusual items, things that Skyrim's established merchants either cannot or will not stock. He is a businessman with a philosophy, operating at the intersection of commerce and cultural identity in a province that does not always see those two things as compatible with his presence. The caravan moves. It always moves. Every few days it breaks camp and settles again outside a different city, refused entry at each one, setting up shop at the gate regardless. Risad has been doing this for a long time. He does not appear to be stopping. The College of Winterhold sits at the very edge of Winterhold, which sits at the very edge of a coastline that was considerably larger before an event called the Great Collapse, partially sank the town into the sea. The college itself stands on a promontory that survived, connected to what remains of Winterhold by a bridge that feels, in windy weather, like it is making a case for itself against the wind and the ice below. The relationship between the college and the town is not warm. The townspeople blame the mages for the collapse, or at least for not preventing it. The mages have varying opinions about whether they deserved this blame and have been living with the accusation for decades. The Jarl of Winterhold sits in a diminished court, in a diminished town, and navigates the political reality of ruling a hold whose most prominent institution is viewed as responsible for its decline. There is a theory held by some students at the college that the Great Collapse was caused by something that happened in Oblivion during the crisis that predated Skyrim by 200 years. The Elder Scrolls universe has a way of allowing large events to leave long consequences, and Winterhold's ruin fits that pattern well enough to be plausible. There is also the theory that the player caused it. The seer at the college during the questline says that the Dragonborn has set in motion events that cannot be reversed. Some fans have argued that this refers retroactively to Winterhold. The timeline does not quite support this. But in a franchise built around the subjectivity of time and the elasticity of causation, the timeline's support is perhaps less definitive than it might seem elsewhere. Winterhold stands. What is left of it stands, at least. The college stands with it, on its promontory, over the ice, as it has for a very long time. The soul gem system in Skyrim operates on a hierarchy that the game introduces gently, and the player refines over time. Petty gems hold weak souls. Common gems hold larger ones. Grand soul gems can hold any soul, and black soul gems, the disturbing variant found primarily in necromancer dens and in the possession of characters who have made certain philosophical choices, can hold human souls. The distinction matters because human souls are grand souls by default, and capturing them in black gems allows for enchanting of the highest possible quality. The presence of black soul gems in the game is one of those lore details that the game does not dramatize. It mentions them as items in the world. Their existence implies a whole architecture of what happens to human souls after death in the Elder Scrolls universe, and that architecture is, by the standards of a game rated for teen audiences, fairly bleak. Human souls captured in black gems are not in the afterlife their culture prepared them for. They are in a gem, being used to make a sword hit harder. This has not significantly distressed most players, who have used black gems enthusiastically in their enchanting builds. The lore implications were registered by the subset of players for whom the lore is the point, and then life continued. The gems do not mind. Gems do not have feelings. That is probably for the best. There is a man in Riften named Bolli, who runs the city's fishery, which sits on the docks at the edge of the city, over the lake. He is a quiet, somewhat heavy-set Nord who appears at first conversation to be exactly what he presents as, a businessman managing a modest operation in a city that has other things on its mind. His wife, Nivenor, is considerably more socially ambitious than the fishery warrants, and the gap between her expectations and their circumstances is not something either of them discusses openly. But Bolli has a secret that the game places in his home as quietly as it places everything else. He is connected to the Thieves Guild, not in a conspicuous way, not in a way that makes him a target or a quest objective. He is simply one of those citizens of Riften who has found it more comfortable to have a working relationship with the people who run the city's underworld than to pretend they do not exist. The fishery, it is implied, moves things occasionally that are not fish. This is presented by the game without judgment and without drama. Riften is a city in which this kind of arrangement is ordinary. The corruption is not a secret. It is the texture of the place, woven into daily commerce and civic life so thoroughly that untangling it would require pulling threads that run through almost every institution the city has. The Jarl knows, the guards know, the fisherman knows. The fish, for their part, are unaware of any of it. In the far east of Skyrim, in Eastmarch, the land takes on a volcanic character that distinguishes it from every other hold in the province. Hot springs bubble up through the ground. Geysers vent steam into cold air. The ground near these vents is warm and supports plant life that would not survive elsewhere in Skyrim, and the landscape as a whole carries the quality of a place that is still being made, still in the process of becoming whatever it is going to be. Windhelm sits at the northern end of Eastmarch, and between the city and the volcanic fields to the south, there is a stretch of road that most players travel quickly and without lingering. But the volcanic fields themselves, approached on foot and with patience, are full of small details. The steam that rises from the vents casts the surrounding rocks in a perpetual soft light that changes as you move around them. The warmth is local and precise. A step away from a vent, and the cold of Skyrim reasserts itself immediately. There are creatures in Eastmarch that live specifically in association with these thermal features. The wildlife distribution in Skyrim is not random. Wolves are more common in forested areas. Mud crabs cluster near water. The animals of Eastmarch's volcanic stretches have been placed where the temperature and the terrain make logical sense for them, and walking through those fields while paying attention to the fauna rewards the attention with a small, coherent ecology. The game never asks you to study this. It is simply there, arranged with the quiet logic of a world that was built to feel inhabited from the inside rather than decorated from the outside. The Thuum, the voice, the way of the voice, the shout, is built on words from the dragon language, but it has a history that precedes the Greybeards' formalization of it as a meditative practice. In the ancient days of Skyrim's early history, before the Greybeards, before the formalized understanding of what the voice was and could be, Nords used the Thuum in battle. They shouted as warriors. They weaponized the language of creation in ways that the Greybeards later described as a misuse of something that deserved more reverence. The ancient Nords who used the voice most powerfully in combat were called tongues. This is a word the game uses, and it carries within it the entire philosophical argument about what the voice is for. The Greybeards believe the voice is a gift of understanding, a means of knowing the nature of all things through their true names, not a tool for destruction. The ancient Nords used it because it won battles. Both of these uses emerge from the same source, and the disagreement between them is one that Skyrim's history never entirely resolved. Ulfric Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm and leader of the Stormcloak Rebellion, knows the voice. He used it to kill the High King, a fact that his opponents use as evidence of a dishonorable act, and his supporters use as evidence of his legitimate authority. The exact same piece of information produces diametrically opposite political conclusions, depending on who is processing it. This is not an accident of the narrative. It is the point. The voice does not choose sides. It has never chosen sides. What it does for whoever speaks it well enough to be understood. Septimus Signus, that isolated scholar on the ice shelf in the far north, spent years in his outpost translating Dwemer constructs and trying to understand the nature of the enormous lockbox buried nearby. What he believed was inside that box was not treasure, not machinery, not some final Dwemer weapon. He believed it contained the heart of a god, specifically the heart of Lorcan, the divine organ that the Dwemer used in their great final experiment, and that was later used by the Nerevarine in the events of Morrowind. Whether he was right about what was inside the box, the game leaves ambiguous at the moment of its opening. The quest line concludes, before the question is fully answered. Septimus himself does not survive to know. But what matters, lore mechanically, is that he was asking the right kind of question. He had followed the evidence as far as it could take him and arrived at a conclusion that within the broader Elder Scrolls cosmology was not unreasonable. He was simply in the wrong body to proceed further. The experiment he wanted to conduct required a specific kind of entity to open the box, and he was not that entity, and so he found a way to use someone who was. The player in this questline is a tool that Septimus uses for a purpose Septimus cannot serve himself. This is not uncommon in Skyrim. Being used is not the same as being used poorly. And Septimus, for all his strangeness, treated the player as the best available instrument for work that genuinely mattered to him. In his world, that was a form of respect. The Thieves Guild's questline eventually leads the player to a place called the Twilight Sepulchre, a sanctuary dedicated to Nocturnal, the Daedric prince of night and darkness, and more specifically, of luck. Nocturnal is a prince who demands devotion without offering the explicit transactions that most Daedric worship involves. She gives luck passively to everyone without acknowledgement. The nightingales, the inner circle of her mortal servants, are not rewarded with power in the traditional sense. They are rewarded with service. After death, a nightingale does not go to whatever afterlife their culture prepared them for. They go to the Evergloam, Nocturnal's plane of oblivion, and they serve as guardians there in perpetuity. This is the agreement. This is what the three nightingales that the player meets during the guild questline agreed to, each for their own reasons, and it is what the player agrees to as well if they accept the role. The character Katariah has spent most of her life in service to Nocturnal and in exile, working to clear her name of a betrayal she didn't commit. When the quest line resolves, she does not retire. She returns to the sepulchre. She takes up her post. The resolution of the story's conflict has freed her from one kind of burden while leaving another entirely intact. She is at peace with this. The game conveys that without making a production of it. Katariah is a person who found a devotion that suits her and has organized her entire existence around it. The devotion is strange, and the terms are severe, and she has chosen it anyway, and chosen it again, and she is content. That is its own kind of freedom. The Forgotten Vale is a region introduced in the Dawnguard downloadable content, reachable only through a specific portal, and it has the quality of a place that was built for people who are no longer there. The snow elves who once inhabited it built temples and paths and maintained a culture that the game describes through architecture and artifact rather than through dialogue, since the snow elves themselves are long gone, transformed into Falmer or reduced to Knight Paladin Gelibor and his extended solitary vigil. The Vale is beautiful in the way that abandoned places can be, the beauty of a space that has been given back to itself. Frost-covered trees and pale stone and the distant sound of water have been joined by the ordinary wilderness of a place with no remaining tenants. Wildlife has moved into the spaces that the snow elves vacated. The paths are still there. The architecture still stands in many places. The civilization is entirely absent. There are 2 shellbugs in the Forgotten Vale, iridescent creatures found nowhere else in the base game, and they can be harvested for carapace materials that are among the best available for certain alchemy recipes. Most players encountered them by accident, startled by the glow. They do not fit the Arctic palette of the region, and they are not explained by any NPC, because there are no NPCs in the Forgotten Vale to explain them. The shellbugs are simply there, glowing softly in the snow, unaccountable and specific, the way that life tends to be in places that have been left alone long enough. There is a book in Skyrim titled The Holds of Skyrim, and it is a dry administrative text that describes the military and civic structure of the province's 9 holds. It is not a lore text that most players would choose to read for pleasure. It covers things like garrison sizes and defensive considerations and the relative strategic importance of different holds in a conflict scenario. It is the kind of book that exists in a world to suggest that the world produces administrative texts, not because anyone was expected to be entertained by it. But it is accurate. The information it contains about the holds, their leadership, their geography, their political relationships, is consistent with what the game presents through direct experience. The book was written to match the world, or the world was built to match the book, and the result is an administrative document that functions as administrative documents function, which is to say that it exists, it is correct, and it is unlikely to be anyone's favorite thing they encountered in Skyrim. There are hundreds of books like this. They line the shelves of the Arcanium at the College of Winterhold. They sit in the personal libraries of jarls and stewards and wealthy merchants. They occupy the reading desks of scholars who never move from behind them. Most of them were written specifically for Skyrim's game world, and the writers who produced them did not receive prominent credit, and the vast majority of players never opened them. The books exist. The world is fuller for their existing. That is what they were for. The Shadow Stone, one of the guardian stones the player can interact with in Skyrim, grants the ability to become invisible once per day. Its counterpart in the Thief's Toolkit, the Muffle spell, the Quiet enchantment, the Sneak perks that reduce noise and shadow, together form a playstyle that the game accommodates fully, and that many players discover accidentally while trying to avoid a fight they were not ready for. Sneaking in Skyrim is governed by a visibility cone and a noise calculation that takes into account the surface being walked on, the weight of the armor being worn, and the proximity of the observer. Stone floors are loud, dirt paths are quiet. Wooden floors announce every footfall to anyone paying attention. This is not explained in any tutorial. It is simply how the world works, and players who sneak enough eventually feel it rather than know it. There is an achievement for picking 300 locks. This requires either an extraordinary commitment to crime or a very long playthrough and a tendency to try every locked door the game presents. The locks in Skyrim are physically simple, a tumbler mechanism rendered in the interface as a needle and a turning cylinder, and the skill required to pick them comes from practice, from learning the slight variations in resistance that indicate where the pick should stop and the cylinder should turn. 300 locks is a large number of quiet, patient moments spent in front of closed doors, convincing them to open. Players who earned that achievement did so one lock at a time, in the dark, with no one watching. Shadowmere is a horse. This is technically true, and also almost entirely insufficient as a description. Shadowmere is a black horse with glowing red eyes who belongs to the Dark Brotherhood and is given to the player during that questline as a gesture of trust and partnership. She is, by the game's combat calculations, significantly more resilient than any other horse available to the player. She will charge into combat alongside the player rather than fleeing. She regenerates health at a rate that makes her difficult to kill under normal circumstances. She is also the horse that in the Oblivion game that preceded Skyrim, the player received under nearly identical circumstances. The same questline, the same organization, the same dark and glowing-eyed companion. Shadowmere appears to have aged well between games, or not aged at all, which is consistent with her association with an organization that has Daedric patronage. The lake near Falkreath, where Shadowmere appears when summoned, is called Shadowmere's Lake on the local map. The lake was named for the horse. The horse does not appear to feel particularly honored by this. She stands at the edge of the water and waits to be ridden, her red eyes reflecting nothing in particular, her patience absolute. She has been doing this for a long time, in different games, in different decades for different players. The Brotherhood has always given her to whoever was worthy of her, and whoever received her has always, in some small way, been changed by it. A horse that charges at dragons without flinching has a way of raising expectations. The Elder Gleam is a tree. This is its entire purpose in the game, to be the oldest tree in Skyrim, a sacred thing, something that predates almost every human settlement in the province. It lives in a cave called Elder Gleam's Sanctuary in the Rift, and getting to it requires passing through roots that block the path in a way that can only be resolved by carrying a specific artifact, Nettlebane, a blade made from Hargraven bone and enchanted specifically to harm nature spirits and sacred vegetation. The choice the game offers at the Elder Gleam is a genuinely quiet one. You can cut it with Nettlebane to harvest a sapling for a woman in Whiterun whose tree is dying. Or you can speak to a pilgrim who is also present in the sanctuary, a man who has come to pray rather than to harvest, and he will offer a different resolution, one that doesn't require the blade. The tree itself does nothing dramatic. It is simply there, enormous and golden lit, in a space where the ceiling opens to let light fall in the only way Skyrim lets light fall underground, through cracks in the stone, in shafts. It smells like all the forests in the Rift concentrated into a single place, if forests had a smell the game could convey. Many players cut the tree without considering the alternative. Many players didn't know there was an alternative. The pilgrim makes his offer quietly. Quiet offers in Skyrim are easy to miss. The Elder Gleam stands. In most playthroughs, it still stands. There is a lighthouse called Hela's Folly on the north coast, and inside it there are burned bodies and a cellar that leads to a small cave network. The note left behind explains, without enough detail to be entirely satisfying, that something happened involving Falmer and that the people in the lighthouse were not prepared for it. The lighthouse stopped functioning, the warning fires went out. Ships that relied on that beacon in the dark had no way of knowing. The tragedy implied by a silent lighthouse is one that the game does not dramatize. It simply leaves the lighthouse there, dark, cold, its keeper and household dead, as a location the player can stumble across while exploring a coastline that most quest lines never bring them to. No quest begins here. No quest ends here. The lighthouse is a complete small tragedy that exists for no narrative purpose beyond being true to a world where coastlines have lighthouses, and sometimes things go wrong at them. Bethesda built a lighthouse. They staffed it. They killed the staff in a way consistent with the threats in that region of Skyrim. They left the note that the last person to understand what was happening managed to write. They put all of this on a stretch of coastline that most players will never visit, and they did it with the same fidelity they brought to the locations that matter to the main quest. The folly was in thinking the lighthouse was unnecessary. The folly was in thinking someone would always be there to light it. The folly was in the gap between what a lighthouse is supposed to do and what happened on that particular dark night. The fire has been out for a long time. The Stormcloaks and the Imperial Legion have been fighting across Skyrim for years by the time the player arrives, and the Civil War is one of those aspects of the game that can either define a playthrough or exist entirely in the background of one, depending on how much attention the player chooses to give it. Most players pick a side at some point. Fewer players sit with the moral weight of the picking. The Stormcloak position that Skyrim belongs to the Nords, that the Empire has bent the knee to the Thalmor, that the Talos Bond is an affront that no self-respecting Nord should tolerate, is coherent and has deep roots in Nordic cultural identity. The Imperial position that only a unified empire can eventually oppose the Thalmor effectively, that the war weakens Skyrim's defenses against a very real existential threat, that Ulfric's ambition should not be confused with his principles, is also coherent and also has legitimate strategic weight. The game does not give either side a clean moral victory. The writing distributes flaws evenly. Ulfric has used the war for personal political advancement in ways that his most loyal followers prefer not to examine. The Empire enforced the Talos ban with varying degrees of enthusiasm and has been complicit in real suffering. The soldiers on both sides are mostly people trying to do what they believe is right. You choose anyway. You have to. The war does not wait for philosophical certainty before requiring a position. The inns of Skyrim, the Bannered Mare in Whiterun, the Sleeping Giant in Riverwood, the Candlehearth Hall in Windhelm, are more than rest stops. They are the information hubs of a pre-modern society, the places where travelers exchange news and where local gossip accumulates into something resembling a newspaper. The innkeepers know things. They know about bounties and rumors and people who have gone missing and places that have recently grown dangerous. Hulda, who keeps the Bannered Mare, will share history about Whiterun if you ask the right questions. Delphine, who kept the Sleeping Giant before her identity as a blade agent became the point, filled her inn's cellar with secrets that the inn's visible surface was designed entirely to conceal. Even the smallest inn has layers. The Villemer Inn in Averstead, at the base of the 7,000 steps, hosts the steady traffic of pilgrims making the climb to High Hrothgar. The conversations that happen there between tired pilgrims who have just come down and those who are about to go up form a social archive that the game implies without staging. Every inn in Skyrim is a theater where travelers briefly become characters in each other's stories before continuing separately into the dark. The Temple of the Divines in Solitude has a complicated piece of architecture at its center. The shrines of the 8 divines are present and functional, offering blessings to worshippers. The 9th shrine, the one that would belong to Talos, is conspicuously absent. There is a space where it was. The space is visible. The priestess Freer maintains the temple. She is an imperial citizen practicing imperial faith in the imperial capital of Skyrim, and the Talos shrine has been removed under imperial law to comply with the white gold concordat. She serves the remaining 8. She does her work. But she does not entirely hide how she feels about this. In conversation, she chooses her words carefully, in the way that people in politically complicated positions learn to do. She knows what the law requires. She knows what the law has displaced. She prays at the shrines that remain and keeps her additional thoughts to herself, mostly in the specific way of a person who has decided that the walls of a temple are not the ideal venue for a political dispute. The empty space where Talos once stood is still there. Freer moves past it every day. She has made no public comment on whether she misses it. There are several locations in Skyrim labeled as dragon lairs, places where dragons nest and can be found between their other activities. These lairs are, from a combat perspective, opportunities for dragon soul absorption and word wall study. From another perspective, they are the homes of creatures with 4,000 years of accumulated history, squatting on mountaintops and coastal cliff tops across the province. What the dragon lairs share architecturally is a fondness for old human structures. The dragons do not build, they occupy. They settle into ruins and on standing stones and at the tops of structures built for other purposes by people no longer present to object to the occupancy. This is consistent with what the lore suggests about dragon psychology. They are territorial. They understand ownership in the most direct possible way. This is mine because I am here and I am strong enough to remain here. The fact that a ruin was built by someone else centuries ago is not a complication. The dragon is present. The previous builders are not. The math is not complicated if the creature doing the math is a dragon. Distant Sovngarde stands not only as a destination in the main quest line, but as a quiet organizing principle beneath the whole of Nordic culture in Skyrim. Every funeral, every song about fallen warriors, every Jarl's hall decorated with weapons of ancestors, all of it points toward that hall beyond the mists. The Nords built a civilization in relationship to their understanding of where the good dead go, and that relationship has shaped everything from their architecture to their funerary customs to the way they speak about courage and defeat. Vignar Greymane in Whiterun talks about death with the matter-of-factness of someone who has been ready for it for years. Many of the older Nords do. It is not bravado. It is the particular piece of people who have been told and who believe that dying well is not the end, that what waits on the other side of a good death is a place worth the journey. Whether they are right is not something the game definitively answers, even when you walk through that place yourself and speak with the honored dead. What the game offers instead is something more honest, the experience of people who believe it and whose belief has made them something in particular. The Nords of Skyrim are who they are, partly because of where they think they are going. Sovngarde shapes the living by existing for the dead. It always has. Whiterun's great tree, the Gildergreen, stands in the city's wind district, in a condition that depends entirely on where the player is in a particular quest line. At the beginning of the game, it is visibly ailing, a large, ancient tree whose bark carries the gray quality of something that has been unwell for longer than most of its observers have been alive. The priestess of Kinnereth in the district wants to restore it. The player can help. The tree, by the end of that small quest, is either regrown from a sapling or revived through a more direct intervention. Either way, the tree changes. The city changes with it, in the specific way that a city changes when a landmark at its center recovers. The people who walk past the Gildergreen every day have been walking past a dying tree, and then they are walking past something that is alive again, and the game does not draw attention to this. It simply shows the tree in its restored state, standing in the Wind District, where it has always stood. Whiterun was built around that tree. The tree predates the city that grew up around it. Some of the old Nords believe it was already ancient when the first walls were raised on the plateau, that it was there before any human hand touched the land it grows from. Whether this is accurate or simply the quality that very old trees acquire in the telling is not something the game resolves. The tree grows. The city grows around it. That is the arrangement, and it has been working for a very long time. The ratway beneath Riften is not a sewer in the conventional sense. It is something more complicated than that, a network of passages and chambers that exist in the city's foundations, carved into or built alongside the stone and timber supports that hold Riften's elevated streets above the lake. The ratway functions as the city's underworld in the most literal possible sense. Beneath the crime and corruption of the streets above, there is a second layer of crime and occupation, populated by people for whom even Riften's ordinary margins were not marginal enough. The vagrants and outcasts who live in the Ratway's upper passages have no particular organization. They survive on whatever they can find or take, and they are territorial in the way that people become territorial when they have very little and are determined to keep it. Their presence there has presumably been tolerated by the Thieves Guild that operates below them because the vagrants serve as a kind of inadvertent security. Anyone trying to reach the Ragged Flagon by force has to pass through a gauntlet of desperate people first. Below the vagrants, the guild operates its headquarters with the quiet professionalism of an organization that has been doing this for generations. The Ragged Flagon has regulars who are not members. It has a fence and a barkeeper and a set of training dummies that the guild's members use to maintain their particular skills. It is, functionally, a place of business. and it runs on schedules and relationships and the slow accumulation of trust that makes any underground economy possible. The lake water filters through the stone somewhere beneath all of it. Riften floats above the whole arrangement, prosperous in its way, crooked in its way, entirely dependent on the various layers of illegal and barely legal commerce stacked underneath it like geological strata. The ancient Nord barrows scattered across Skyrim are, within the game's fiction, exactly what they appear to be. Tombs. They were built to house the honored dead of early Nordic civilization, warriors and leaders whose remains deserved permanent commemoration in stone. They were built to last. They have lasted. The mechanisms inside them, the pressure plates, the swinging blades, the rotating pillars with their claw-lock puzzles, are not explained as traps set by the builders. They are the natural consequence of burial spaces designed to be sealed. The Draugr that animate and patrol those same passages are a more complicated matter. Nordic burial tradition, as the game's books explain, involved a practice of certain powerful individuals choosing to remain in a kind of undead vigil after death, a commitment to guarding the place of their rest that extended beyond the ordinary end of things. This was considered honorable. The Draugr are not monsters in the sense that they are aberrations. They are custodians. Very old, very hostile custodians who have been standing watch for a very long time, but custodians nonetheless. This reframing does not make them easier to fight, but it changes what it means to enter a barrow without invitation. You are not exploring an abandoned ruin. You are walking into someone's tomb while the resident is still home, still capable of objecting, and extremely committed to the position that you should not be there. The Draugr are right, in a narrow technical sense. The barrow belongs to them. The circumstances under which the player needs to be there do not change the fact that the need was not anticipated by the original occupants when they chose their resting place. There is an alchemist in Whiterun named Arcadia who runs a shop called Arcadia's Cauldron on the city's main market street. She is an imperial woman, which makes her a slight anomaly in a city and a hold that have a notably Nord-heavy identity, and she has been established in Whiterun long enough that her shop is simply part of the street's texture. She sells ingredients and potions. She gives a small discount if the player has helped the people of Whiterun in a specific way. She is, by the game's standards, an unremarkable presence. But Arcadia's Cauldron contains a detail that rewards wandering. The shelves and surfaces of her shop are stocked with more alchemical ingredients than she formally sells. Plants and fungi and miscellaneous organic materials are arranged throughout the space in the way that a working shop would actually arrange them, not as display items, but as inventory, as tools in the middle of being used. There are ingredients that are simply there, without a purchase prompt, because they are part of the environment of an alchemist's working space. The shop smells, in whatever sense a visual medium can suggest smell, of dried herbs and something slightly sharp underneath. It has the quality of a space that is actively in use, that someone returns to every morning and works in throughout the day, that has accumulated the traces of that daily labor over years. Arcadia did not set up her shop to impress visitors. She set it up to work in. The distinction is visible in the arrangement if you take a moment to look at it rather than through it toward the purchase menu. The companions in Jorvaskr keep a collection of weapons mounted on the walls of the mead hall that are not described or named in any formal way. They are simply there, axes and swords and shields arranged with the casual permanence of things that have been in the same place for so long that no one thinks about them as choices anymore. They are part of the room the way the timbers are part of the room, structural, unremarked, foundational. But the companion's relationship to weapons is unlike most guilds' relationship to their tools. The warriors who drink and eat and argue in Jorvaskar's main hall are people for whom weapons are not equipment in the professional sense. They are personal. The particular axe a companion carries says something about who they are and how they fight, and the weapons on the walls represent a history of that relationship going back to the founding, to Ysgramor and the 500 companions who came with him from Atmara, many of whom the companion's current members can claim lineage from. There is a plaque or small marker near the weapons that acknowledges briefly that some of these pieces came from the earliest days of the companion's existence. Whether or not this is entirely true, whether the axes on the wall are genuinely ancient or simply old enough to seem it, the belief serves the same function that all such beliefs about foundational objects serve. It connects the present practitioners to the tradition they practice. It reminds them that they are not the first and were not meant to be the last. The mead in Jorvaskr is served cold. The tradition it is served inside is very warm. Windhelm is the oldest city in Skyrim, and it carries that age in specific ways. The Palace of the Kings, Ulfric Stormcloak's seat of power, is a building of such obvious antiquity that it makes the newer construction around it look provisional, as though the city grew up around the palace rather than the palace being built for the city. Its stone is darker than the surrounding buildings. Its proportions are those of an era when buildings were built to declare permanence rather than comfort. Inside the Palace of the Kings, the daily life of a military headquarters in the middle of a civil war proceeds around a set of details that most players only half notice. The war table, the maps, the soldiers who sleep in the hall because there is no proper barracks. The steward who manages the administrative side of a rebellion with the resigned efficiency of someone who did not sign up to run a campaign but finds themselves doing so regardless. Jorleif, the steward, has opinions. Most of them are about logistics. He is the person who has to actually make the Stormcloak operation function on a daily basis, who has to think about food and firewood and where to billet soldiers and how to respond to the civilian concerns of a hold that is trying to be both a functioning city and the capital of an armed resistance at the same time. His concerns are not glamorous. They never are at the level of the steward. The glamour belongs to the Jarl. The work belongs to Jorleif. He carries it without complaint. There is a kind of heroism in that, though it is not the kind that gets songs written about it. Solstheim, the island introduced in the Dragonborn downloadable content, has a quality that Skyrim's mainland does not quite share. It is an island that has belonged to multiple civilizations at different times, and the layering of those civilizations is visible in the landscape. The ashfall from the Red Mountain of Morrowind covers the eastern half of the island in a gray that deepens toward the coast where the ash is heaviest. Under that ash are the remnants of Dunmer settlements, of an ecology that was different before the eruption, of a history of the island that the ash interrupted rather than erased. The western half of Solstheim is different, greener, colder, more recognizably Nordic in its landscape and in the people who occupy it. The Skal villages sit in the northwest with the particular insularity of a community that has maintained its traditions through centuries of pressure and change. The Skal are Nords who took a different path from the mainland Nords, more spiritually attentive to the land, less interested in the martial glory that defines Nordic identity in Skyrim proper, and in possession of a cosmological understanding that the rest of Skyrim tends to dismiss without having examined. Stalrim, the ancient burial ice that the Skal treat as sacred and that functions as a crafting material in the expansion, is a case study in the difference between a cultural artifact and a material resource. For the Skal, Stalrim is the ice that preserves their honored dead. It is a spiritual substance that the burial tradition of their people requires them to handle with specific reverence. For the Nords and Dwemer who come to Solstheim without that cultural context, Stalhrim is an unusually fine crafting material with exceptional frost enchantment properties. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The ice does not know which of them is truer. The city of Falkreath is small enough that everyone in it can claim some awareness of everyone else's business, and the business of Falkreath tends toward the elegiac. The cemetery, the largest in Skyrim, is maintained with a care that the rest of the town's civic infrastructure does not always match. The headstones are legible, the graves are tended. The priests of Archay who manage the place take their responsibilities seriously in a way that has given Falkreath a particular reputation across the province. Archay, the divine of birth and death and the cycles between them, has a more consistent presence in Falkreath than in most other cities. The town's relationship to death is not morbid in the way that outsiders sometimes assume. It is practical. Falkreath has more experience with the management of mortality than most places, and that experience has produced not a culture of grief, but a culture of accommodation. Death happens, it has always happened. The important thing is that it is handled properly. The gravedigger Runel tends graves that belong to people he never knew. He reads the names on the stones and gives them a moment of his attention each day, which is perhaps more than they receive from anyone else. The people of Falkreath walk past the cemetery to reach the inn, the blacksmith, the general goods store, without thinking much about the scale of what they are walking past. Several thousand years of the dead, arranged in stone and silence, at the edge of a town that has made its peace with proximity. There are graves in Falkreath's cemetery for people who died before Skyrim was Skyrim. The oldest stones are barely readable. The town has never considered moving them. Books in Skyrim serve several functions simultaneously. They are lore delivery systems for players who want to understand the world more deeply. They are environmental detail that makes shelves look like shelves rather than furniture. They are the record of a civilization that produces text, that has scholars and historians and poets and fiction writers and bureaucrats, all of whom put words on paper for reasons that have nothing to do with the player's questline. And occasionally, they are genuinely interesting to read. The book A Game at Dinner presents a mystery in the form of a letter written by an anonymous author describing a dinner party at which a Dwemer noble has poisoned the food, and the letter's author, a guest at the party, must deduce which of the available foods is safe to eat by observing which ones the host avoids. It is a logic puzzle embedded in a piece of in-world fiction, and it predates Skyrim by several Elder Scrolls games. The puzzle has an answer. Players who find the book and read it carefully enough can solve it. The Remonata is a different kind of text entirely, a collection of creation myths and theological speculation that reads like a dream, structured as a series of visions rather than a linear account. It is difficult reading, and it is not trying to be anything else. It exists in the game because the Elder Scrolls universe is one that takes its own mythology seriously enough to produce the kinds of texts that serious mythological traditions produce, including the ones that are not easy to understand and were not intended to be. Some of Skyrim's books are readable in an evening. Some of them are readable across a lifetime. The library at the College of Winterhold contains both kinds, shelved without preference. Riften's Black-Briar family occupies a position of quiet dominance in the Hold that has no formal basis in Skyrim's political structure. Maven Black-Briar is not a Jarl. She holds no appointed office. She runs a meadery, employs a large number of people in the city, and maintains relationships with both the Thieves Guild and the Dark Brotherhood that give her access to forms of enforcement that the official mechanisms of the law are not equipped to compete with. The Black-Briar Meadery is the source of Honningbrew Mead's primary competition, and a whole questline in the Thieves Guild storyline involves sabotaging that competitor on Maven's behalf. It is not a morally complicated mission. Exactly. You are helping a person with considerable power consolidate slightly more of it. But it is a mission that reveals something about how Riften's economy actually functions. Maven does not compete in the marketplace through the quality of her product or the attractiveness of her prices. She competes through the systematic removal of competition. Her children, Hemming, Ingun, and Sibi, each represent a different dimension of what the Black-Briar position produces in the people who grow up inside it. Hemming has absorbed his mother's transactional view of the world without her intelligence, which makes him dangerous in a specific way. Ingun has retreated into alchemy with a depth of focus that has given her genuine expertise and a quality of detachment from the family's power games. Sibi is in jail for murder. The Black-Briar children are not a unified portrait of what privilege does to people. They are three separate answers to the same question. Maven herself gives the impression of someone who has been running these calculations for a very long time and has become genuinely comfortable with what they require. The weather in Skyrim is not decorative. It changes. Storms arrive on schedules that the game's climate system generates dynamically, and the changes in weather carry genuine atmospheric consequences for the player's experience of moving through the world. Walking from Markarth to Solitude on a clear day is a different experience from making the same walk in a blizzard, even along the same roads through the same geography. Snow accumulates in specific places. It lies in the hollows of rocks and on the tops of walls and on the surfaces of paths in ways that suggest drift and accumulation rather than uniform coverage. The weather that produced the snowfall visible on the ground and the weather currently occurring are connected in the game's rendering in a way that most players feel as rightness without being able to articulate why. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, appear above Skyrim at night in colors that shift slowly across the sky. They are visible from most high points in the province and from the flat tundra of Whiterun Hold on clear nights. The game's aurora is not accurate to real northern lights in every technical detail, but it captures the quality of the phenomenon, the slow, uncanny movement, the sense of scale, the feeling that something very large is happening very far away, and you are being allowed to watch. No questline requires you to watch the aurora. No NPC ever tells you to look up. The lights are simply there, on the nights when the sky is clear, doing what northern lights do in places cold enough and dark enough for them to be visible. The game trusts that some players will look. The game has always been right about that. The Thieves Guild's Nightingale armor is one of the most visually distinctive sets of equipment in the game. Dark, form-fitting, engraved with iconography related to Nocturnal's aesthetic of shadow and concealment. It is, from a pure design standpoint, the kind of armor that communicates its allegiance entirely through its appearance. Looking at someone in Nightingale armor, what they are and who they serve. But the armor has a lore dimension that most players who wear it do not fully absorb. The Nightingales are not simply elite Thieves Guild members. They are, in the framework of Nocturnal's worship, the living extension of a pact that predates the current guild by several generations. The three Nightingales, at the time the player joins, those are Katariah, Brynjolf, and the Dragonborn, are bound to the Twilight Sepulchre in a way that extends beyond their deaths. The armor is not equipment in the ordinary sense. It is a uniform of office, and the office continues after the person wearing it is gone. There is a chamber in the Twilight Sepulchre where previous Nightingales are referenced, where the tradition of service to Nocturnal is physically manifest in the space. Standing in that chamber in the full Nightingale set, with the understanding of what the armor represents and what it commits the wearer to, is a different experience from standing in Ulfric's war room or in the college's Arcanium. Those places represent authority and knowledge. This one represents a specific kind of contract. The armor fits perfectly. It always does for nightingales. Nocturnal attends to certain details. The companion's inner circle, Codlac Whitemane, Skior, Ayla the Huntress, Vilcus, Farkas. Each carries the lycanthropy that defines the circle's particular distinction from the ordinary membership. But their relationships to that condition are not uniform. Ayla embraces it. Skior embraced it. Codlac desperately wanted to be free of it before his death, believing that it would bar him from Sovngarde. This disagreement is quiet in the way that serious disagreements within tight communities tend to be quiet. The circle does not argue about it openly. They are warriors and they are practical. But the underlying tension is there in every conversation Codlac has about his wish to die clean of the beast blood, and in Ayla's response to his death, which is not the careful grief of someone who shared his regret, but the angry grief of someone who loved him, despite a fundamental disagreement about what he was and what he should have valued. Farkas and Vilcus are twins, which the game mentions, and then largely allows to simply be a fact rather than a dramatic element. They are different from each other in ways that the game develops slowly through small conversational textures. Farkas is direct. He prefers the physical to the analytical. He is not unintelligent. He is simply most himself when the question in front of him has a clear physical answer. Vilcus is more reflective. He is the companion's scholar, the one who finds meaning in the history of the tradition rather than purely in its practice. They fight together seamlessly. They always have. The coordination of twins who have trained together since childhood is visible in how they occupy the same spaces in Jorrvaskr without collision, moving around each other with the quiet ease of people who have always known exactly where the other one was. Dawnstar has 3 primary power figures who are in a quiet conflict with each other that the player can observe but cannot fully resolve. Jarl Skald the Elder is a Stormcloak loyalist of advanced age who is committed to the rebellion with an intensity that his steward and housecarl find increasingly difficult to manage. His housecarl Jode thinks Skald has let his political commitments override his judgment on military matters. His steward Medina is a court wizard who hates violence in a city whose Jarl is enthusiastically pursuing a war, and she makes no secret of this. The 3 of them occupy the Jarl's longhouse in the particular tension of people who serve the same institution from fundamentally incompatible positions. Skald gives orders. Jod carries them out while trying to quietly correct their most damaging elements. Medina serves her function, while privately, occasionally openly, opposing the entire premise of the conflict she has been drafted into supporting. This dynamic is almost entirely background. It is not the subject of any questline. It is simply the political texture of a hold at a specific moment in its history, rendered in the daily behavior and available conversations of 3 people trying to do their respective jobs in an environment that does not make any of those jobs easy. Dawnstar was dealing with the nightmares already. The political atmosphere of the Longhouse is a different kind of disturbing, and the game allows both to coexist without explaining which one the hold finds harder to live with. The ancient Dwemer city of Nchuanzel lies beneath Markarth, accessible through a door in the Understone Keep, the great hall carved into the rock that serves as Markarth's seat of government. It is one of the more significant Dwemer ruins in Skyrim in terms of scale, and it has a specific history attached to it. A group of scholars and their guard detail went in some time before the player arrives and did not come out. A questline involves finding out what happened to them. What happened to them was the Falmer, as it so often is in Dwemer ruins of significant depth. But the notes and journals left behind by the expedition members before things went wrong give the ruin a human texture that most Dwemer sites lack. The scholars were excited. They were making discoveries. They were writing careful observations about mechanisms and rooms and the particular qualities of Zell's Dwemer engineering, comparing it to other sites and drawing conclusions about regional variation in Dwemer architectural practice. And then the Falmer arrived, and the notes end with the specific abruptness of notes that were never intended to be the last entry. The scholar named Strom made it furthest. His notes are found deepest in the ruin. He was still observing and recording even after the situation had clearly become dangerous, because he was a scholar and he had come there to observe and record, and the presence of lethal danger in the surrounding passages was not, for him, a sufficient reason to stop doing the thing he had come all this way to do. He was wrong about that, ultimately. His notes are still correct. There is a village called Karthweston in the Reach that exists in a state of ongoing dispute between two competing interests. A mine owner named Einethak, who has legal claim to the silver veins in the hills above the village, and the silver blood family of Markarth, who want those veins and are using hired mercenaries to exert pressure on Einethak until he sells. The village's residents are caught in the middle, unable to work the mine while the mercenaries occupy it, dependent on the mine for their livelihood, and uncertain about whether Einethak will be able to hold his position. The player can intervene in either direction, supporting Einethak's right to his own property, or facilitating the Silverbloods' acquisition of it. The game presents the choice, without particular advocacy, for either side, though the relative sympathies of the named characters are fairly clear. Einethak is the small landowner. The Silverbloods are already powerful. What is interesting about Karthweston is how small it is and how serious its problem is. This is not a city with the resources to protect itself through political maneuvering or formal legal processes. It is a handful of people in a handful of buildings, economically dependent on a single mine, in a hold where the rule of law is contested by both a civil war and the ongoing forsworn insurgency. The mercenaries are not illegal, exactly. The pressure is not illegal, exactly. It is simply what power does when it wants something, and the formal mechanisms of resistance are unavailable to the people being pressured. Karthweston manages, barely. It has been managing barely for longer than the Silverbloods have been interested in its mine. There is a location in Skyrim called Secunda's Kiss, a small camp near the White River that exists without any attached questline or notable loot or named enemy. It is simply a camp. Someone has been living there, or was living there recently, and the evidence of that habitation is arranged around a small fire pit with the particular casualness of a space that was set up for practical rather than decorative reasons. A bedroll, a cooking pot, a small collection of items that a person traveling alone might carry. Bethesda populated their world with dozens of places like this, small camps and shelters that are not dungeons and not cities and not points of interest in any formal sense, but that occupy the space between those categories, the way that real landscapes always have people in them occupying the spaces between formal destinations, the traveler between cities, the hunter who camps where the game is, the person who has decided that a certain spot near a river is for now home enough. These locations rarely have explanations. The people who occupied them are either long gone or have wandered far enough from the fire that they are not currently visible. The story implied by the arrangement is the only story available, and it is always partial. A bedroll and a cooking pot and a view of the White River tells you that someone chose this place. It does not tell you why, or for how long, or where they went when they left. This is how most of the world's occupation actually looks, if you examine it at the right scale. Not grand settlements, not famous ruins, just people finding places that will do for a while. The Forsworn are among the most politically complicated enemies in the game, They are, within the fiction, the indigenous Reachmen, the people who lived in the Reach before the Nords conquered it, who briefly reclaimed it during a period called the Markarth Incident, and who were subsequently driven back into the hills when the Empire helped the Nords retake the city. They are classified as enemies. They attack on sight. They occupy camps and ruins across the Reach and prey on travelers without apparent discrimination. They are also, depending on which sources you consult, entirely justified in their anger. The Reach was theirs. It was taken from them. The one period in living memory when they held it was ended through military force and political betrayal, and the people who participated in the Reachmen's brief governance of their own territory were executed or driven out. Madanach, the king in rags, the forsworn leader imprisoned in Sidna Mine, has been in that mine for decades, and put there not because of what he believes, but because what he believes was inconvenient to the people who took his city back. The game gives you the opportunity to interact with Madanach in the Sidna Mine questline, and that interaction is one of the more nuanced political encounters in Skyrim. He is not presented as simply right or simply wrong. He is presented as a person with a coherent position and considerable grievances and methods of pursuing those grievances that have made the Reach more dangerous for everyone, including the Reachmen themselves. History in the Reach is not settled. It may never be. There is a lighthouse keeper at Solitude's docks named Horgir, who has a complicated relationship with a woman named Octave San, a relationship that is complicated primarily because Horgir is an alcoholic, and Octave resents this, and the resentment has accumulated over enough time to have become a fixed feature of their interactions rather than a temporary state. She wants him to stop drinking. He drinks. This is the entirety of their visible dynamic when the player encounters them. But there is a quest line, brief, optional, easily missed, that allows the player to actually do something about Horgir's drinking. A potion is involved. The outcome, if pursued, changes something about how Horgir carries himself in subsequent conversations. He is not transformed. He is not suddenly a different person. He is simply a person who has, with some help, addressed one thing that was making his life and his relationships smaller than they could be. Octavia's response to this change is the part that is most easily overlooked. She is grateful. Not dramatically grateful. This is Skyrim, not a romance narrative, but genuinely, quietly pleased in the way that people who have wanted something for a long time and finally gotten it tend to be. She does not turn this into a large moment. She simply continues living her life, which is now marginally better than it was. The lighthouse keeps working, Horgir keeps it. The light falls across Solitude's harbor in the evenings, and neither of them comments on the improvement that has been made, because some improvements are like that. They just become part of how things are. The Amulet of Mara is an item that most players encounter early in their time in Skyrim. It can be purchased from a priest of Mara in Riften's temple, and equipping it signals to certain NPCs that the player character is interested in marriage. The marriage system in Skyrim is comprehensive enough to be functional and limited enough that its functional edges are visible if you look for them, but it produces genuine domestic arrangements that have their own textures. Different marriage candidates react to being proposed to differently. Some are surprised. Some seem to have been waiting for it. Some have quest lines that must be completed before the option becomes available, which means the player has already done something significant for the person before the question is ever asked. The act of marriage is preceded for these characters by a history. The ceremony takes place in the Temple of Mara in Riften, presided over by Maramal, the priest who sold you the amulet. It is a small ceremony. There are witnesses vaguely referenced. The words exchanged are brief. And then you have a spouse, and the spouse can move into your home, and there is a small daily income from whatever business they run, and they can cook for you, and occasionally they say something that suggests they have thoughts about how things are going. Mjol the Lioness, one of the marriage candidates, is also a fierce critic of the Thieves Guild and the corruption in Riften. She can be married and moved to a home in another city, which removes her from the political environment she spent so much of her energy opposing. Whether this constitutes a resolution or an evasion is not something the game adjudicates. She goes where you go. She carries her opinions with her. The city of Winterhold, separate from the college that dominates its remaining skyline, has a population of perhaps a dozen permanent residents. A jarl, a steward, a housecarl, an innkeeper, a handful of others who have stayed when most of the town's inhabitants left or were lost in the Great Collapse. It is one of the smallest holds in Skyrim in terms of settled population, though geographically it encompasses a significant stretch of the northeastern coast. The Jarl of Winterhold, some courier, governs a hold that has been reduced to something that functions more like a large village than a seat of power. He has a court, he has responsibilities, he makes decisions about the management of a hold that no longer has very much for those decisions to apply to. His authority is real and his jurisdiction is vast, but the practical weight of that authority is very light because there is very little left to govern. His wife Thena and their son Asur live in the Jarl's longhouse with the particular quietness of people who have adjusted to a life that is smaller than it was intended to be. Asur is being raised in a capital city that consists of a bridge, an inn, and a building that most of the remaining residents blame for everything that went wrong. He will grow up to inherit a hold that may or may not still exist in anything like its current form by the time he is old enough to rule it. This is presented without editorializing. Winterhold is what it is. The Jarl governs it. The college studies. The wind comes off the sea of ghosts with the same indifference it has always had toward the question of which of them will outlast the other. The alchemy system in Skyrim operates on a logic of combination. Individual ingredients carry multiple effects, and combining 2 or 3 ingredients that share at least one effect produces a potion or poison with those shared effects. Most players learn this system gradually, discovering useful combinations through experimentation. Some players discover it through the game's ingredient description system, which reveals one effect per ingredient each time the raw ingredient is eaten. The range of effects available through alchemy is wider than most players fully explore. Restoration potions are familiar. Invisibility is familiar. But the system also produces poisons of considerable creativity, lingering paralysis effects, stamina drain, the ability to damage the magicka of spellcasting enemies over time. These applications require understanding not just what a single ingredient does, but what combinations of ingredients produce together. Some ingredients have effects that do not obviously cohere. The canis root, for example, has effects that span multiple damage types, and a paralysis component that makes it useful in combinations a player would not intuitively construct. The blue butterfly wing contributes to some of the most valuable poisons available and also to the most effective fortify enchanting potions, which means that a butterfly, decorative, quiet, visible in the meadows around Whiterun, is one of the most economically significant creatures in the game's resource ecology. The butterflies do not know this. They orbit the lavender as they have always done, and someone is always watching them, and the watching is almost always the thing that comes just before the collection. Kine is the Nordic name for Kinnereth, the divine of the sky and wind and the natural world. The theological distinction matters in Skyrim more than it might in other contexts, because the Nord tradition of venerating Kine has a specific shape that the imperial cult's version of Kinnereth does not quite replicate. Kine in the Nord tradition is the widow of Shor, the Nord's name for Lorcan, the god whose sacrifice or defeat or trick The accounts disagree, resulted in the creation of the mortal world. She is connected to hunting, to falconry, to the Thuum itself. The way of the voice, according to Nordic tradition, is ultimately her gift. This means that the path the player walks in the main quest line, the path of the Dragonborn, learning the shouts, defeating Alduin, is, in the oldest Nordic theological framework, a path that Kine laid down and that Kine's chosen figure walks. The Dragonborn is not merely special in a game mechanical sense. Within the cosmology that Skyrim's characters inhabit, the Dragonborn is a figure woven into the theological structure of Nordic civilization going back to its origins. Arngir would disagree with this framing. He would argue that the Dragonborn's connection to the voice is spiritual rather than political, that it is a gift for understanding rather than for conquest. He and Keen's traditions would find considerable agreement on this point, and significant divergence on the question of what the understanding is supposed to be used for. The wind that blows through the throat of the world's courtyard does not clarify which of them is more correct. Raven Rock on Solstheim began as an East Empire Company mining outpost, a piece of imperial commercial expansion planted in an island that had previously been given to Morrowind as part of a diplomatic arrangement. The East Empire Company mined ebony ore from the Raven Rock mine, established a small colonial settlement, and operated there for decades before the mine's ebony veins appeared to be exhausted. When the economic justification for the colony disappeared, most of the colonial population left. A small settlement of Dwemer refugees, displaced by the eruptions of the Red Mountain, remained. The Raven Rock of the Dragonborn quest line is that Dwemer settlement, decades further along. The East Empire Company's infrastructure has been repurposed for a different community. The mine that seemed exhausted has been sealed for reasons that become clear during the quest line. The colonial history of the settlement, its origins as an extraction enterprise rather than an organic community, sits in the background of every conversation about what Raven Rock is and what it owes to whom. Second Counselor Arano manages the community with the particular weariness of an administrator in a place that needs more than administration can provide. The settlement survives. It does not currently thrive. The people in it have built something genuine in a space that was originally built for something entirely different, and the gap between what was intended and what actually grew is where Raven Rock's character lives. The mine matters. The mine is always what matters in a mining town. The question of what is in it and whether it can be recovered is the question that everything else turns on. In the mountains south of Whiterun, along the path toward Helgen, there is a small roadside shrine to Talos that appears frequently in Skyrim's roadside iconography, a simple stone marker, a carved face, a small offering left by a traveler. These shrines exist throughout the province, unofficial and persistent, as evidence of a practice that the law has banned, but that the land has not stopped accommodating. The shrines are not on anyone's property exactly. They appear at the edges of roads and at the tops of passes and in clearings that belong to no particular hold's jurisdiction. Someone maintains them. Someone leaves offerings at them, not always fresh, not always recently, but the accumulated evidence of ongoing attention. Someone has decided that the official position on Talos worship does not apply at this particular stone at the edge of this particular road. There are Falmer patrols that the player encounters on Skyrim's roads, and those patrols are searching for exactly this kind of unofficial devotion. The game frames them as antagonists, and their behavior in these encounters, arresting or killing people for private religious practice, provides a fairly efficient moral shortcut for the player's sympathies. But the shrine's persistence across the province, maintained despite the risk, says something about what happens when official prohibition runs into private conviction. The stone face carved into the shrine does not change expression regardless of what political arrangements surround it. It looks the same whether the Empire controls the hold or the Stormcloaks do. The devotion it represents was never dependent on official permission. Dragon's Reach in Whiterun is remarkable for a reason beyond its size and its position above the city. The Great Hall contains, in a sealed chamber below its main floor, a dragon. Numenex, the dragon captured by Olaf One-Eye in Skyrim's ancient history, died in Dragon's Reach, and his skull now dominates the main hall's far wall. The hall was literally built around the project of capturing and containing him. The architecture of Whiterun's seat of power was shaped by a decision made thousands of years ago to catch a dragon and put him inside a building. The main questline uses this history when it requires a live dragon to be captured in the same facility. The Jarl, Balgruf the Greater, has spent his career governing a hold whose most prominent feature is a building designed to trap his own greatest threat. He is not a small man. The Balgruf conversations that involve dragon policy reveal someone who has thought carefully about the relationship between Whiterun's symbolic center and the crisis unfolding around it. And his permission to use Dragon's Reach for its original purpose in the middle of a civil war carries the weight of someone who understands exactly what he is agreeing to. Balgruf has been careful throughout the Civil War to stay formally neutral, a position that has made him unpopular on both sides and has preserved Whiterun as a functioning city while the holds around it chose their allegiances. When the dragon crisis reaches a point where neutrality is no longer possible, his response is not the collapse of an exhausted diplomat. It is the decision of someone who has been waiting to see what would actually require him to choose. Dragons, it turns out, are sufficient reason. There is a character in Riften named Wujida who works at the fishery and who is, when the player first encounters her, in the grips of skooma addiction. Skooma is a drug in Skyrim, a moon sugar derivative that appears throughout the province as a contraband item, associated with addiction and criminal networks and a general deterioration in the lives of people who use it. Wujida is one of the few NPCs in the game who is presented as actively struggling with this, rather than simply being categorized as a criminal. She will ask the player for a healing potion, not for the skooma, for the pain of withdrawal that she is experiencing as she tries to stop. The request is small, and the game does not frame it dramatically. A healing potion is an extremely common item. Most players have dozens of them. Giving one to Wujida costs nothing significant. In exchange for this small help, Wujida shares information about who is supplying her with skooma, information that begins a questline about the skooma trade operating through Riften's docks. The questline has a resolution and a reward and a satisfying narrative arc. But the thing that initiates it is not a dramatic, inciting incident. It is a person in pain asking for the most basic kind of help, and a player deciding to give it. This is one of those points where Skyrim quietly demonstrates what it understands about how most things actually begin. Not with a dramatic call to adventure, with someone asking for help and someone else saying yes. The roads of Skyrim carry, at various points, a character type that is easy to miss in the general noise of traveling, the lone pilgrim. These are characters who have no quest lines, no significant loot, no dramatic backstory revealed through conversation. They are simply people walking from one place to another for reasons connected to their faith. A pilgrim to the Shrine of Talos might be heading to one of the unofficial roadside markers. A pilgrim to Kinnereth's Grove might be following a route that has been walked by believers for generations. One of these pilgrims, encountered on the road to High Hrothgar, has been making the 7,000 steps climb repeatedly. Not once, as most pilgrims do, multiple times, across what appears to be an extended period of devotion or penitence, or simply a practice of returning to the mountain, because the mountain is where their practice takes them. She has no quest associated with her regular ascent. She goes up and she comes down and she makes the journey again because that is what her devotion requires. The 7,000 steps are marked with inscriptions, tablets set into the stone at intervals on the climb, each one carrying a piece of text related to the Thuum and the Greybeards' philosophy. The inscriptions are not counted precisely by the game. The steps are a tradition, and the tradition counts them as 7,000 in the way that traditions count large numbers, as a gesture at magnitude rather than a precise enumeration. The pilgrim who climbs them repeatedly has read the inscriptions many times. She may have them memorized. She keeps reading them anyway, because that's part of what the repetition is for. The soul of Arniel Gain is something that the game allows you to possess, technically, as a result of a quest line in the College of Winterhold that ends in an extremely specific kind of tragedy. Arniel is a researcher, obsessed with understanding what happened to the Dwemer, particularly with replicating the experiment that they conducted with the heart of Lorcan. He believes that understanding the mechanism of their disappearance will require actually performing the relevant steps at reduced scale. This goes about as well as you would expect. Arniel does not exactly die. He also does not exactly survive. He performs his experiment, and he undergoes a transformation that is clearly connected to what the Dwemer experienced, and what remains is a ghost who appears briefly and then dissipates without further conversation. The Conjure Arniel's Shade spell, obtained as a result of his research, summons something that was once Arniel, that is still, in some technical sense, Arniel, to assist in combat. The Shade does not speak. It follows. It fights for a limited duration, and then fades. Whether what is summoned has any awareness of what it is, or what it was, or what it is doing, is not addressed by the game, because the game does not always address the most disturbing implications of its own systems. The Shade appears. The Shade helps. The Shade fades. Arniel's research produced exactly what it set out to produce, which was an understanding of what happened to the Dwemer. He simply could not share the results. There are giants in Skyrim, enormous humanoid beings who tend mammoths and build fires and are entirely uninterested in the player's existence until the player makes themselves interesting through aggression or proximity. They live outside settlements, in camps arranged around mammoth herds, and they move through the holds with the unhurried permanence of creatures that have never been successfully told they do not belong there. The giants' camps contain evidence of a culture that the game does not fully explain. The totem poles, enormous carved wooden structures that surround the camps, have a significance within the giants' tradition that no NPC in Skyrim can translate, because no NPC in Skyrim has bothered to learn. The carvings on these poles are not random. They repeat motifs. They suggest a visual language that communicates something, though what it communicates to the giants looking at it is not available to any outside observer. Giants milk the mammoths. They make a cheese from that milk. The cheese is a consumable item, mammoth cheese, that the player can take from camp containers if they are careful enough or bold enough. The giants are making food. They are managing animals. They are practicing, in their way, the kind of pastoral economy that Skyrim's human and elven cultures also practice, scaled up to their own physical reality. They seem, on balance, to want very little from the world around them. They want their mammoths left alone and their camps left undisturbed, and these are not unreasonable wants. The world around them does not always honor them. The enchantments available at disenchanting stations in Skyrim represented a taxonomy of magical effects that the Dwemer, the ancient Nords, and a handful of other traditions contributed to the province's accumulated magical knowledge. Some enchantments are available from the beginning of the enchanting skill tree. Others are locked behind specific levels of skill or behind the requirement that a player finds and disenchants a specific item that carries that effect. The Fortify Barter enchantment, which improves prices in the player's favor at merchants, is carried by items found in specific locations, and learning it opens an economic optimization path that most players never fully pursue. A character with highly developed speech, fully upgraded Fortify Barter enchantments on multiple items, and access to potions that further boost the relevant stats can theoretically buy and sell things at prices that bear almost no relationship to their listed value. This is presented not as an exploit, but as a feature. Bethesda designed a system of economic influence that rewards investment across multiple skill trees and creates a character archetype, the merchant adventurer, the skilled negotiator, that is entirely distinct from the combat archetypes the game is more famously associated with. This character is just as viable as a warrior or a mage. They simply express their power in a different direction, not in how hard they can hit enemies, but in how efficiently they can convert the world's resources into wealth and wealth into further capability. The city of Solitude's marketplace has never known what to make of this character when they visit. The merchants remain polite regardless. There is a map of Skyrim that exists within the game world itself, not the player's fast travel map, but an actual physical map that hangs in various Jarl's halls and military headquarters, showing the holds and major features of the province in a style consistent with the cartographic conventions of Tamriel's medieval analog civilization. These in-world maps are accurate, more or less, to the geography that surrounds them. They were drawn by someone within the fiction, for purposes within the fiction. Looking at an in-world map in Dragon's Reach while standing in Dragon's Reach gives a specific quality to the experience, the sense of being inside a representation of the place you are inside. The map shows where you are standing. It shows the roads that lead away from the city. It shows the holds that the Jarl is governing and the holds he is watching. It is a practical object in the hands of people who need it to be practical, and it is simultaneously a work of cartographic craft made by someone who cared about the accuracy and presentation of their work. Maps in Skyrim's lore are not neutral documents. The people who made them had perspectives. The hold borders on a map made by an imperial cartographer might fall differently than the same borders on a map made by a Stormcloak sympathizer. What a map includes, and what it omits, reflects who made it and for whom. The maps in the Jarl's halls were made for Jarls. They emphasize what Jarls need to know. Near the end of a long journey through Skyrim, the world begins to look different. Not because it has changed. The mountains are where they always were. The roads run where they always ran. The cities stand as they stood at the beginning. It looks different because you have changed the scale of your attention. You have learned to notice things. A candle placed near a window in a house that no questline ever asks you to enter. The name carved into a headstone in a graveyard you walked past 100 times before stopping. The sound of rain against the stone of Whiterun's walls, which is different from the sound of rain against the wooden rooftops of Riverwood. None of these things were put there for you to notice. They were put there because this world was built by people who believed it deserved to be built with care, even in the parts that would go unexamined. The fish swimming in rivers no questline ever sent you to. The bee that orbits the lavender near the road. The names of Greybeards, whose dialogue extends no further than their names. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.